My name is Rebecca, and I am 34 years old. Make sure you do not wear your uniform today because no one cares about your Navy career, and the groom family expects high society, not government workers. That was the text my father sent me exactly 3 hours before my sister walked down the aisle. He thought he had put me in my place. He thought I would shrink into the background like I always did. It is funny how things work out because the second I walked into that ceremony, 300 battle-hardened Navy SEALs jumped to their feet. A commander shouted "Admiral" on deck, and the entire room fell into a dead silence. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who completely underestimated your worth. I had just landed stateside after an exhausting 8-month classified deployment. I am a lieutenant commander in Navy intelligence attached to Naval Special Warfare. For the past 240 days, my life had been a blur of high-stakes briefings, tactical planning, and sand. So much sand. My body ached in ways that sleep could not fix. I had spent countless nights awake in a command center staring at satellite feeds and making decisions that kept my people alive behind enemy lines. We operated in complete secrecy under the cover of darkness. My team relied on my intelligence to execute their missions and return home safely. The physical and mental toll of carrying that responsibility was heavy, but I was profoundly proud of what we had accomplished. We had dismantled threats that the American public would never even know existed. Stepping off the military transport plane and onto American soil felt surreal. The air smelled different here. It smelled like rain and pine trees instead of dust and diesel fuel. I hoisted my heavy duffel bag over my shoulder. In my other hand, I carefully carried a thick black garment bag. Inside that bag was my pristine Navy dress whites uniform. It was perfectly pressed and adorned with the ribbons and medals I had earned over a decade of service. I was looking forward to wearing it. I was looking forward to seeing my family after being away for so long. I thought maybe just this once we could have a normal family reunion. I found a quiet corner in the terminal and finally powered on my personal cell phone. It had been turned off for months due to operational security. The screen lit up and a flood of missed messages and voicemails began pouring in. I watched the notifications cascade down the screen, hoping to see a message from my mother Patricia or my father Richard welcoming me home. I hoped for a message from my younger sister Chelsea, saying she was excited for me to be at her wedding today. Chelsea was marrying a hedge fund manager named Preston, and the family had been talking about this wedding for 2 years. Instead of a warm welcome home, I saw a single text from my father sent just 10 minutes ago. I opened it, and the words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Make sure you do not wear your uniform today. No one cares about your Navy career, and the groom family expects high society, not government workers. I stood there in the middle of the busy airport terminal reading the text over and over again. High society, government workers. He made my decade of service, my sacrifices, and my command sound like I was a mall security guard crashing a royal ball. The familiar sting of rejection washed over me. I was 34 years old and a high-ranking officer in the United States Navy. But in that moment, I felt like a worthless child again. Growing up in our affluent neighborhood, I was always the disappointment. Chelsea was the golden child. She was a social media influencer who posted pictures of her expensive lattes and designer outfits. My parents funded her lifestyle completely. They paid for her luxury apartments, her vacations, and her failed business ventures. They loved having a beautiful daughter who fit their perfect aesthetic. I was the opposite. I was athletic and driven, and I wanted to serve my country. When I earned my college degree through a military scholarship, my father was only relieved that he did not have to pay for it. He took the money he had saved for my college and gave it to Chelsea for a startup company that went bankrupt in 3 months. He never apologized. He never acknowledged my hard work. He just told me I should be grateful they gave me a roof over my head when I was a kid. The word government worker echoed in my mind. It was such a deliberate insult. It reduced my rank, my clearances, and my sacrifices to nothing more than a bureaucratic desk job. He knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted to make sure I felt small before I even arrived. He wanted to protect his fragile ego and impress a family of wealthy hedge fund managers who had never faced a day of real hardship in their entire lives. I thought about the men in my unit. I thought about the bravery I witnessed every single day on deployment. And then I thought about Preston and his family sitting in their glass towers, moving money around and calling themselves successful. The contrast was nauseating. But I refused to let my father win this mental game. I had survived interrogations and hostile environments. I could survive an afternoon with my family. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. A rational person might have replied and argued. A rational person might have turned around and booked a flight back to the base. But I was just so tired. I was tired of fighting for my space in this family. I took a deep breath and slid the phone into my pocket without replying. I looked down at the black garment bag in my hand. My uniform represented honor and courage and commitment. It represented the men and women I served with, the ones who made it home and the ones who did not. My father wanted me to hide it because Preston and his wealthy family might find it tacky. I tightened my grip on the handle. I decided right then that I was not going to hide. I was going to go to the bridal suite and act like I never saw the text. I just wanted to see my sister on her wedding day. I hailed a rideshare car outside the terminal and gave the driver the address of the exclusive country club where the wedding was taking place. The drive took nearly an hour. I leaned my head against the cold glass of the car window and watched the scenery change from industrial airport buildings to sprawling suburban estates. The trees grew taller and the houses grew larger the closer we got to the venue. I thought about Chelsea. I genuinely wanted her to be happy. Even though she had always joined in when my parents mocked me, I still held on to this foolish hope that we could be real sisters. I remembered when we were kids before the social climbing, and the money completely consumed her. We used to play in the backyard and pretend we were explorers. Now she was marrying Preston, a man who sneered at anyone who made less than 7 figures a year. My parents adored him. He was exactly the kind of son-in-law they wanted. He wore custom suits and drove imported cars and talked down to waiters. He was the perfect addition to their pristine image. The car turned through a massive wrought iron gate and proceeded up a long, winding driveway lined with ancient oak trees. The country club was a massive stone building that looked like a European castle. Valets in crisp uniforms were rushing around parking luxury vehicles. Florists were carrying massive arrangements of white roses and peonies through the front doors. It was a chaotic scene of extreme wealth and privilege. I thanked the driver and stepped out of the car. The humidity of the afternoon hit me immediately. I was wearing my comfortable travel clothes, a pair of dark jeans, and a plain gray sweater. I knew I looked out of place among the country club staff and the early arriving guests in their designer suits. I ignored the strange looks I received from the valets and walked confidently toward the main entrance. I held my heavy duffel bag on one shoulder and carried my precious garment bag in my other hand. I navigated through the opulent lobby. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, and the floors were made of polished marble. A large sign pointed the way to the bridal suite down a long, carpeted hallway. As I walked down the hall, I could hear the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses echoing from behind a set of double doors. I paused for a moment outside the room. My heart was pounding in my chest. I had faced hostile fire in foreign countries without breaking a sweat, but the thought of opening this door and facing my family made my hands tremble. I closed my eyes and took a slow, measured breath. I told myself to be strong. I told myself to focus on the joy of the occasion. I reached out and pushed the heavy wooden doors open. The bridal suite was a massive room filled with natural light from floor-to-ceiling windows. Hair and makeup artists were bustling around setting up their stations. Bridesmaids in matching silk robes were sipping champagne and taking photos on their phones. My mother, Patricia, was standing in the center of the room, giving orders to a stressed-looking wedding planner. And there was Chelsea sitting in a velvet chair, getting her hair curled. She looked beautiful. For a split second, I felt a rush of genuine happiness for her. I stepped fully into the room and let the heavy doors close behind me. The loud click of the latch drew everyone's attention. The laughter died down, and the room went completely silent. My mother turned around, and her perfectly painted smile vanished the second she saw me. She looked me up and down, taking in my casual travel clothes and my heavy military bags. She did not run to hug me. She did not ask how my deployment was. She did not say she missed me. Instead, her eyes locked onto the black garment bag in my hand, and her expression hardened into a glare of pure disdain. I took a step forward into the room. The scent of hairspray and expensive floral perfume was overwhelming. It smelled like artificial perfection. Chelsea looked at me through the mirror in front of her. She did not turn around to greet me. She just stared at my reflection with a look of mild annoyance, as if a delivery driver had walked into the wrong room. My mother took a step toward me. Her eyes darted around the room, checking to see if any of the makeup artists or photographers were paying attention to this awkward family reunion. She clearly wanted to usher me out of sight as quickly as possible. The heavy black garment bag in my hand felt like a shield. I held it tightly, knowing that the pristine white uniform inside was the only armor I needed against their judgment. I stepped further into the suite, placing my heavy duffel bag near the door, but keeping the black garment bag firmly in my right hand. The room was a whirlwind of activity, but the silence that had fallen upon my entrance lingered like a heavy fog. Against the far wall, a rolling metal rack held the bridesmaid dresses. They were all a delicate shade of pale peach. 5 of them were identical, featuring elegant silk draping and flattering necklines. At the very end of the rack hung a 6th dress. It was a completely different style. It had high, ruffled shoulders and an excessive amount of cheap-looking tulle that seemed designed specifically to add awkward volume to anyone wearing it. A small white tag hung from the hanger with my name written in careless cursive. I walked toward the rack, intending to simply take the dress and find a place to change. I did not want to cause a scene. I just wanted to get through the day. Chelsea watched me through the vanity mirror. She waved away her makeup artist and stood up, smoothing the front of her white silk robe. She walked over to a silver tray on the center table and picked up a massive glass pitcher filled to the brim with orange juice and champagne. She poured herself a glass, but kept her hand firmly wrapped around the heavy crystal handle of the pitcher. She turned and walked directly toward me. The suite was spacious and the floor was completely clear of obstacles. Chelsea wore flat slippers. There was absolutely nothing for her to trip over. Yet as she closed the distance between us, she suddenly lurched forward. She let out a loud theatrical gasp and threw her arms out. The entire pitcher of sticky orange liquid flew through the air. The mimosa mixture splashed directly onto the peach bridesmaid dress hanging on the rack. The pale fabric instantly absorbed the dark orange juice, leaving massive, ruinous stains across the bodice and the skirt. The sticky liquid dripped onto the marble floor, forming a rapidly expanding puddle at my feet. "Oops," Chelsea said the word with a bright, artificial chirp. She did not look sorry. She looked incredibly satisfied. She set the empty crystal pitcher down on a nearby table and picked up her champagne glass, taking a slow, deliberate sip. "I guess I am just so overwhelmed with wedding jitters. My hands are completely shaking." She held out a perfectly steady hand to demonstrate her false claim. The makeup artists and hairstylists in the room stared in shocked silence. No one moved to grab a towel. No one offered to help. They all knew exactly what they had just witnessed. Chelsea looked at the ruined peach fabric dripping onto the floor, and then looked at me. She let out a soft, mocking laugh. "Well, it is probably for the best anyway. That style would have made your shoulders look way too bulky. You've been doing too many push-ups in the dirt over there in wherever you were deployed. You would have looked like a linebacker trying to squeeze into a ballerina costume. It would have ruined the entire aesthetic of my bridal party." I stared at the ruined dress and then at my sister. The sheer malice of her action was staggering, but it was not surprising. Chelsea had spent her entire life trying to make me feel oversized and unfeminine. When I joined the military, she used my physical training as a constant punchline for her jokes. She spent thousands of dollars of our parents' money on personal trainers and cosmetic procedures, while I built my strength running obstacle courses and carrying gear. She hated that I possessed a type of physical power she could never buy. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I looked at the orange puddle on the floor and asked how she expected me to stand at the altar with her now. My mother, Patricia, swooped in before Chelsea could answer. Patricia did not rush over to hand me a towel or scold her golden child for destroying an expensive piece of clothing. Instead, she marched straight toward me with her face pulled into a tight scowl. "Look at this massive mess you have caused, Rebecca." Patricia pointed a sharp manicured finger at the floor. "You just walked into the room and immediately brought this terrible negative energy. You are making your sister anxious on the most important day of her life. Why are you always standing in the way of her happiness? You are completely ruining the high society aesthetic we have worked so hard to curate for Preston and his family. They are expecting elegance and grace. They are not expecting a clumsy disaster in the bridal suite." I looked at my mother in pure disbelief. I had been standing completely still when Chelsea threw the pitcher. I pointed this out calmly, stating that Chelsea was the one who ruined the dress. Patricia waved her hand dismissively, brushing away my logic as if it meant nothing. "It does not matter how it happened," Patricia snapped. "The fact is that you no longer have a dress to wear. You cannot possibly stand up there with the other girls looking like a sticky orange disaster. You will embarrass us in front of the entire country club. You will embarrass Preston in front of his wealthy relatives. We cannot have a ruined dress immortalized in the professional wedding photographs." Patricia turned and walked briskly to a closet near the bathroom. She opened the door and pulled out a cheap wrinkled black polyester shirt and a pair of ill-fitting black trousers. She marched back and shoved the crumpled fabric into my chest. "I found this spare catering uniform in the staff locker room downstairs," Patricia said, her voice dripping with command. "Since you do not have a bridesmaid dress anymore, you can put this on. You can stand near the kitchen doors during the ceremony and blend in with the waitstaff. If anyone asks, you can just say you are helping coordinate the appetizers. It is a perfectly suitable option for someone who works for the government anyway." I held the cheap polyester fabric in my hand. The disrespect was so profound it almost felt surreal. My mother was asking a high-ranking military officer who had just returned from a combat zone to wear a borrowed waiter uniform and hide by the kitchen. She wanted to disguise me as hired help so she would not have to explain my presence to a family of hedge fund managers. I dropped the catering uniform onto a chair. I told her I would absolutely not be wearing a waiter uniform to my own sister's wedding. Patricia crossed her arms over her chest and glared at me. "Then what exactly do you plan to wear?" she demanded. "You cannot wear those casual travel clothes, and you certainly do not have anything appropriate in that duffel bag of yours." She looked down at the black garment bag I was still gripping tightly in my right hand. "What is in there anyway? Did you bring a suit?" "I told you specifically that this is a formal high society event." I unzipped the heavy black vinyl just a few inches. The bright, pristine white fabric of my navy dress whites gleamed under the chandelier light. I shifted the bag so the gold buttons and the edge of my colorful ribbon rack were visible. "I brought my uniform," I said, keeping my tone completely even. "I am an active duty officer in the United States Navy. It is a formal uniform and it is perfectly appropriate for a formal wedding." Patricia physically recoiled. She took a step back and her face twisted into a mask of pure disgust. Chelsea let out a loud dramatic groan from her makeup chair. "Are you kidding me right now?" Chelsea whined loudly. "You want to wear a military costume to my wedding? You just want everyone to stare at you instead of me. You always have to make everything about your stupid Navy career." Patricia stepped forward again and pointed her finger directly at my face. "You will absolutely not wear that tacky government outfit to this wedding." Patricia hissed, her voice low and threatening. "You look like a glorified security guard. Preston family will think we are entirely classless. They deal in international finance and real estate. They do not associate with people who wear name tags and follow orders for a living. I will not allow you to parade around the venue showing off those cheap little medals and begging for attention." I zipped the garment bag back up. I stood my ground, looking my mother directly in the eye. I told her that I would be wearing my uniform because it was the only formal clothing I possessed. I told her that I had earned every single medal on my chest through blood and sweat and sacrifice. I maintained my military bearing, refusing to let my voice shake or my posture falter. I was calm, collected, and resolute. Patricia saw that she could not bully me out of the uniform. Her eyes narrowed and her jaw clenched tightly. Fine. She spat the word out like poison. If you insist on wearing that ridiculous security guard costume, you will not be allowed anywhere near the main ceremony seating. You will not be in a single photograph. You will not stand at the altar with your sister. We have an overflow tent set up in the back of the lawn near the parking lot for the minor vendors and the plus ones we did not actually want to invite. You will sit in the very back row of that overflow tent. You will stay completely out of sight. You will stay away from the cameras and you will stay away from Preston family. If you show your face in the main hall, I will personally have the real security remove you from the premises. The ultimatum hung in the air. Wear the catering uniform and hide by the kitchen, or wear my military uniform and be banished to the parking lot tent. They expected me to cry. They expected me to yell or break down or beg for their acceptance. They expected the exact same reaction I had given them when I was a teenager, desperately seeking their approval. But I was not a teenager anymore. I was a lieutenant commander who had stared down much worse enemies than a narcissistic sister and a shallow mother. I looked at Chelsea, who was smirking at me through the mirror. I looked at Patricia, who stood with her arms crossed, expecting a victory. I tightened my grip on my garment bag. I will take the overflow tent, I said calmly. I turned around without another word. I did not slam the door. I did not stomp my feet. I simply walked out of the bridal suite with quiet, absolute dignity, leaving them to steep in their own toxicity while I prepared to wear my uniform with pride. I navigated the labyrinth of carpeted hallways until I found what I was looking for. The employee break area was tucked far away from the crystal chandeliers and champagne flutes of the main country club. I found a small, isolated locker room that smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. It was a stark contrast to the luxurious bridal suite I had just left, but it was exactly what I needed. I unzipped the heavy black garment bag and carefully lifted my navy dress whites off the hanger. The fabric was immaculate and blindingly bright under the harsh fluorescent lights of the locker room. As I removed my travel clothes and began the methodical process of dressing in my uniform, my hands moved with practiced precision. I fastened the gold buttons and aligned the fabric. I adjusted my collar devices, ensuring the gold oak leaves sat perfectly flush. I picked up my ribbon rack. The colorful rows of military decorations represented years of grueling deployments, tactical operations, and profound sacrifice. Pinning them precisely above my left pocket, I felt the familiar weight of the metal against my chest. That physical weight anchored me. It reminded me of exactly who I was and what I had survived. The cold metal against my fingertips also dragged my mind straight back to the night before. The memory of the rehearsal dinner played out in my mind like a poorly directed movie. Preston family had rented out the entire top floor of an exclusive downtown steakhouse. It was a room dripping in generational wealth and hedge fund arrogance. The air was thick with the scent of roasted prime rib and expensive cigars. Preston parents held court at the head of the long mahogany table, treating the waitstaff like invisible machinery. My parents, Richard and Patricia, spent the entire evening desperately trying to match their energy. They wanted to prove that our family belonged in this elite circle. They wanted to prove that Chelsea was the perfect addition to their corporate dynasty. I had worn a simple tailored navy dress and sat near the bottom corner of the table. I kept quiet and observed the spectacle. Halfway through the dinner, Richard tapped his crystal wine glass with a silver spoon. He stood up and beamed at the room. He delivered a toast that sounded more like a shareholder presentation than a fatherly blessing. He spoke at length about Chelsea and her brilliance. He bragged about her massive social media following and her entrepreneurial spirit. He painted her as a self-made corporate titan who was destined to merge empires with Preston. The hedge fund executives nodded in polite approval. Then my father made the mistake of turning his attention to me. He could never just elevate Chelsea. He always had to tear me down in the process to make her look taller. Richard gestured toward my end of the table with a patronizing chuckle. He told the crowd of millionaires that every family needs someone to do the heavy lifting in the public sector. He said the military was a fantastic safety net for people who lacked the killer instinct required for the real corporate world. He described my highly classified intelligence career as a glorified government desk job. He told Preston's father that I basically stamped passports and checked ID badges for a living. The entire table erupted in polite, condescending laughter. Preston smirked and shook his head. Patricia chimed in, saying that they always worried about my lack of ambition, but were just glad I had steady health insurance. I sat there gripping my napkin under the table. I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, but I maintained a perfectly neutral expression. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction in front of an audience. When the dinner finally concluded and people began mingling, I immediately walked out to the private open bar in the adjoining lounge. I needed space to breathe. I ordered a glass of club soda and stared out the window at the city lights. I did not get to enjoy the quiet for long. Richard marched into the lounge and cornered me by the mahogany bar. His face was flushed from expensive scotch, and his voice carried a sharp, aggressive edge. He demanded to know why I was sulking in the shadows. He told me I was embarrassing him by acting so stiff and rigid. He said I needed to smile more and network with Preston uncles because they could probably get me a low-level security management job when I finally got tired of playing soldier. I set my glass down on the bar with a sharp click. I looked my father dead in the eye and told him I had absolutely zero interest in working for a hedge fund. I told him he had no right to diminish my career to impress a room full of strangers. Richard scoffed and crossed his arms. He said he was just stating facts. He claimed my stubborn refusal to enter the business world was a massive disappointment after everything he had provided for me. That was the spark that ignited the powder keg. I took a step closer to him and lowered my voice into a dangerous whisper. I told him to stop pretending he had provided anything for my future. I laid out the financial truth that our family never spoke about aloud. I reminded him that I did not choose the military just for the challenge. I chose it because it was my only way to get an education. I reminded him that when I was 18 years old, he emptied my entire college savings account. He took the $50,000 I had worked for and saved, and he handed every single penny of it to Chelsea. He funded her vegan skincare line that failed in 4 months. He funded her luxury event planning app that never even launched. He funded a lifestyle boutique that went bankrupt before the grand opening. He drained my future to bankroll her delusions of grandeur. I told him I took an ROTC scholarship because I had absolutely nothing left. I signed away years of my life and deployed to hostile war zones because he stole my safety net to buy Chelsea followers and inventory. Richard's face turned a violent shade of purple. He looked around frantically to make sure no one had heard me. He leaned in and pointed a finger directly at my chest. He gaslighted me with practiced precision. He told me I was completely delusional and ungrateful. He claimed the college fund was his money to do with as he pleased, and he chose to invest it in the child who actually showed entrepreneurial promise. He hissed that putting a roof over my head and feeding me for 18 years was expensive enough. He told me to stop playing the victim and grow up. He said my jealousy over Chelsea's success was pathetic, and that I needed to fix my attitude before the wedding ceremony or I would face severe consequences. Richard spun around and stormed out of the lounge, leaving me alone at the bar. I stood there gripping the edge of the polished wood, trying to regulate my breathing. I felt completely isolated. But as I turned to leave, I noticed a figure sitting in the shadows of the lounge. In a high-backed leather wing chair sat Preston Grandfather Harrison. He was the billionaire patriarch of the Grooms family, the man everyone in the room had been terrified of offending. He possessed a distinct, sharp bearing that commanded absolute authority without him ever having to raise his voice. He had been sitting there the entire time. He had heard every single word of my father's abuse and my financial revelation. I froze, expecting him to make a condescending remark or report my outburst to Patricia. Instead, Harrison slowly leaned forward into the light. He looked nothing like his arrogant son or his smug grandson. He had deep lines etched into his face and eyes that looked like they had seen the absolute worst of humanity. I recognized his posture immediately. It was the rigid, unyielding posture of a military veteran. Harrison did not say a word to me. He did not offer empty pity or unsolicited advice. He simply picked up his heavy crystal glass of bourbon and raised it toward me in a silent, deliberate salute. His eyes locked onto mine with profound, absolute respect. Then he shifted his gaze toward the door where my father had just exited, and his expression morphed into a look of absolute freezing disgust. That silent interaction spoke volumes. It was a momentary lifeline in a sea of hostility. The harsh fluorescent lights of the country club locker room brought my mind snapping back to the present moment. I blinked away the memory of the rehearsal dinner and focused on my reflection in the smudged mirror above the sinks. My uniform was flawless. The stark white fabric contrasted sharply with the dark ribbons on my chest. I placed my white service cover onto my head and adjusted the brim until it sat perfectly level. I did not look like a disappointment. I did not look like a failed corporate drone or a glorified security guard. I looked exactly like what I was, a commanding officer in the United States military who had survived far worse things than a toxic family wedding. I picked up my duffel bag and tucked it neatly into the corner of the locker room. I checked my watch. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in exactly 45 minutes. Patricia had made her ultimatum very clear. I was to stay away from the main hall. I was to stay away from the cameras and the wealthy guests. I was to march myself out to the overflow tent in the back lawn by the parking lot and sit with the minor vendors and the unwanted plus ones. They wanted me hidden. They wanted me out of sight, so their perfect high society aesthetic would remain untarnished. I smoothed the front of my jacket one last time. I took a deep breath and opened the locker room door, stepping out into the carpeted hallway. I was fully prepared to accept my exile. I was fully prepared to sit in the back row of a humid tent and watch my sister marry into a family of arrogant strangers. I walked with my shoulders pulled back and my chin held high. I navigated through the back corridors of the country club, making my way toward the rear exit that led to the parking lot. I did not know that the text message currently sitting in my pocket was about to change the entire trajectory of the day. I did not know that my commanding officer was already inbound. I just kept walking, ready to hold the line in the shadows, while the rest of the world prepared for a wedding they would never ever forget. I kept walking down the dimly lit service corridor toward the rear exit. The heavy fabric of my uniform brushed against my legs with every steady step. My mind refused to stay in the present moment. It kept dragging me back to the lounge from the night before, diving much deeper into the exact words my father had used to try and break me. When he backed me into the corner of the mahogany bar, he thought he could rewrite our family history right then and there. He pointed his finger at my chest and told me I was ungrateful for the lavish lifestyle he had provided. I had looked at his flushed, angry face and felt a cold wave of absolute clarity wash over me. I did not raise my voice, but I made sure my words cut through the air like broken glass. I reminded him of the exact day I discovered my future had been stolen. I was 17 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of university acceptance letters. I asked him for the account details for the college fund my grandparents had left me. He did not look guilty or apologetic. He just casually mentioned he had reallocated those investments to support Chelsea and her vision. I reminded him, standing there at the bar, that his reallocation was just a polite corporate word for theft. He took $50,000 that belonged entirely to me and handed it to Chelsea to finance a vegan skincare line. I watched her blow through the entire marketing budget in 3 months by taking her friends on a luxury vacation to Mexico. When that business folded, he gave her another massive check for an event planning application that never even had a single line of code written because she paid a fraudulent developer she met at a nightclub. He drained my safety net to buy Chelsea's social media followers and warehouse inventory that ended up rotting in a rented storage unit. I told him I had to scramble to salvage my own life. I went to the military recruiting office the very next morning. I signed my name on a contract and secured an ROTC scholarship because I had absolutely nothing left. I spent my college years waking up at 4 in the morning to run miles in the freezing rain, while Chelsea slept until noon in a luxury apartment he paid for. I earned my commission through sweat and blistered feet and sheer willpower. I looked him dead in the eye and told him he had no right to claim credit for my independence. I told him his financial betrayal was the only gift he ever truly gave me, because it forced me to become someone who would never need to rely on him again. Richard tried to gaslight me right there in the lounge. He scoffed and crossed his arms, telling me I was completely delusional. He claimed the college fund was his money to manage as he saw fit, and he chose to invest it in the child who actually showed entrepreneurial promise. He hissed that putting a roof over my head and feeding me for 18 years was expensive enough. He told me to stop playing the victim and grow up. He said my jealousy over Chelsea and her success was pathetic. He demanded I fix my attitude before the wedding ceremony, or I would face severe consequences. Then he spun around and stormed out of the lounge, leaving me alone at the bar. That was the exact moment I truly noticed Harrison. He was Preston's grandfather and the billionaire patriarch of the family my parents were so desperate to impress. He had been sitting in the deep shadows of a high-backed leather wing chair the entire time. He was a man who possessed billions of dollars in global real estate and corporate assets, but he wore a simple dark suit and a plain silver watch. He did not flaunt his wealth or demand attention like his arrogant grandson did. He sat quietly holding a heavy crystal glass of amber bourbon. The lighting in the lounge was dim, but I could see the sharp, piercing intelligence in his eyes. Harrison had watched the entire abusive exchange without saying a single word. He had listened to my father berate my military service in the main dining room. He had listened to the bitter revelation about the stolen college fund by the bar. He had watched Richard gaslight me, an attempt to break my spirit. He did not intervene during the argument, but his silence was incredibly loud. I noticed the way he held himself in that leather chair. His back was perfectly straight. His shoulders were squared and relaxed. It was the undeniable posture of a man who had served in the armed forces. I recognized the subtle signs of a combat veteran immediately. When our eyes met across the quiet room, there was a profound and silent understanding between us. He saw exactly what kind of man my father was. He saw the toxic dynamic of my family laid bare, without any of the high society polish they tried to project. Harrison slowly leaned forward into the light. He did not offer empty pity or unsolicited advice. He simply raised his glass of bourbon toward me in a deliberate, silent salute. It was a gesture of absolute respect from one soldier to another. His eyes locked onto mine with a fierce sense of solidarity. Then he shifted his gaze toward the door where my father had just exited. The respectful expression on his face instantly morphed into a look of absolute freezing disgust. He saw right through the fake corporate smiles and the desperate social climbing. He knew exactly what kind of soulless people my parents were. That silent interaction in the lounge fueled my steps as I finally pushed open the heavy metal door at the end of the service corridor. I stepped out into the humid afternoon air, leaving the air-conditioned comfort of the country club behind. The transition was jarring. The suffocating heat of the parking lot hit me like a wall, but I kept walking. I crossed the freshly cut grass toward the designated overflow tent. It was set up far away from the main ceremony seating, just as Patricia had promised. A massive hedge of white roses and blue hydrangeas completely blocked the view of the altar. My parents had designed the layout this way on purpose. They wanted to make absolutely sure the professional photographers and videographers could not capture anyone sitting in this remote section. The tent was filled with cheap white folding chairs and plain plastic tablecloths. It looked like a setup for a low-budget corporate picnic, not a high-society wedding event. The catering staff were already using the back tables to store empty cardboard boxes and extra napkins. A few minor vendors and distant relatives were milling around, looking extremely uncomfortable in the summer heat. Buzzing insects hovered near the edges of the canvas roof, adding to the miserable atmosphere. I walked down the center aisle of the tent, ignoring the curious stares and whispered comments from the people around me. My pristine white uniform stood out starkly against the drab surroundings. I walked to the very last row of chairs. I chose a seat in the darkest corner of the tent, facing the back of the floral hedge that hid my sister from view. I sat down and smoothed the crisp fabric of my white trousers. I placed my hands neatly in my lap and stared straight ahead. I was exactly where my family wanted me. I was completely out of sight and out of mind. They believed they had won. They believed they had successfully hidden the family disappointment away in the shadows so they could parade around with their wealthy new in-laws. They thought their perfect aesthetic was safe from my government worker presence. They assumed I would sit quietly and absorb the disrespect, just like I had done when I was a child. I reached into my pocket and touched the smooth glass surface of my cell phone. The screen was currently dark, but I knew exactly what message was waiting there. My commanding officer had told me to hold the line. I knew my brothers in arms were close. I did not know the exact details of what was about to happen, but I knew my isolation in this suffocating tent would not last long. I leaned back in the cheap folding chair and allowed a small, quiet smile to touch my lips. I thought about Harrison sitting inside the luxurious main hall, watching my parents perform their fake joy. I knew he was waiting for the truth to come out just as much as I was. The string quartet started playing a soft classical melody in the distance, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin. I took a deep breath of the humid air and waited for the storm to arrive. The humidity inside the canvas overflow tent was suffocating. I sat in the cheap folding chair for 10 minutes before the stagnant air made it impossible to breathe. The catering staff were frantically moving boxes of frozen appetizers around me, ignoring my presence. I decided I could not sit in this sweltering oven for another hour while the guests arrived. I stood up and smoothed the creases from my white trousers. I needed a glass of ice water before the ceremony officially commenced. I figured I could step back inside the air-conditioned main building for 5 minutes, grab a drink from the lobby bar, and return to my banishment without causing a scene. I pushed through the canvas flaps of the tent and walked back across the lawn toward the stone facade of the country club. I pulled open the heavy glass doors and stepped into the grand foyer. The blast of cold air conditioning was an immediate relief, but the atmosphere had shifted drastically since I left the locker room. The venue was swarming with Preston and Chelsea invited guests. It was a parade of regional power brokers, corporate sharks, and political figures. Men wearing custom-tailored Italian tuxedos were shaking hands and laughing loudly. Women in thousands of dollars worth of designer silk and diamonds were air-kissing each other cheeks. I saw the CEO of a major tech conglomerate handing a thick envelope to one of Preston's groomsmen. This was not a celebration of love. This was a high-stakes networking event disguised as a wedding. It was an opportunity to solidify their social standing and merge their bank accounts. I walked slowly toward the marble-topped bar in the corner of the room. My crisp white navy dress uniform stood out like a beacon against the sea of black tuxedos and pastel chiffon gowns. I did not try to hide. I walked with the measured, confident stride ingrained in me from years of military service. As I moved through the crowd, the conversations nearest to me began to die down. People paused with their champagne flutes halfway to their mouths, turning their heads to stare. A few of the younger hedge fund managers looked at me with open confusion, unable to comprehend why a member of the armed forces was walking through their exclusive party. I noticed a few older men standing near the back wall. They wore expensive suits, but carried themselves differently. When I walked past them, they stopped talking and offered me polite, respectful nods. They recognized the gold oak leaves on my collar and the colorful rows of decorations on my chest, knowing exactly what it took to earn them. I reached the bar and politely asked the bartender for a glass of ice water. He handed it to me with a nervous smile. I took a slow sip and turned around to scan the room. That was when I saw him. My father Richard was standing near the grand staircase holding a glass of scotch and laughing enthusiastically at a joke made by a venture capitalist. He looked incredibly proud of himself. He was exactly where he had always wanted to be, surrounded by immense wealth and unchecked power. Then his eyes drifted across the room and locked onto me. The fake corporate smile vanished from his face instantly. The color drained from his cheeks, returning in a violent, angry flush. I could see the panic flooding his system. I was the one thing he could not control. Richard shoved his scotch glass into the hands of a passing waiter. He excused himself from the venture capitalist with a tight, forced smile and began marching across the marble floor directly toward me. He moved with a stiff, aggressive gait, dodging between the wealthy guests without apologizing. I remained perfectly still, leaning casually against the edge of the bar, holding my water glass as I watched him approach. He stopped inches from my face, closing the distance so his body physically blocked me from the view of the room. He leaned in close, his breath smelling heavily of expensive liquor and mints. "What do you think you are doing?" He hissed, his voice a venomous whisper, meant only for my ears. "I told you to stay in the tent. I told you to keep out of sight." I took another calm sip of water. I looked at his flushed, angry face and replied that I simply needed a drink before the ceremony started. I told him I was not bothering anyone. Richard slammed his hand flat against the marble bar. "Do not play games with me, Rebecca," he sneered. "You marched right into the center of the main hall to show off. You are deliberately trying to upstage your sister on her wedding day." He pointed a trembling finger at my chest directly at my ribbon rack, "Showing up here covered in those tacky pieces of metal like you are begging for attention. You look ridiculous. No one in this room cares about your little government participation trophies. These people build actual empires. They create real wealth. You are just a public servant wearing a cheap costume." His words were designed to slice right through my confidence. He wanted to reduce my decade of combat deployments, tactical planning, and classified intelligence operations to a pathetic cry for attention. He wanted me to feel embarrassed by the uniform that represented my entire life. I looked down at the medals he had just called tacky. There was a decoration for leading a highly classified extraction in hostile territory. There was a commendation for a joint task force operation saving dozens of Allied lives. My father saw nothing but cheap metal because he possessed absolutely no concept of honor. To him, success was only measured by offshore bank accounts and country club memberships. He was completely blind to any kind of value that did not have a dollar sign attached. Richard leaned closer, pushing his face into my personal space. "You are ruining everything," he growled. "Chelsea is upstairs having a panic attack because you refuse to just be a normal, supportive sister." Patricia had to give her medication to calm her down. "We invited the most powerful families in the state to this wedding. Preston father specifically asked me why there was a military officer walking around his private event. You are making us look like we belong to the working class. You are making me look like a failure because my oldest daughter could not secure a proper corporate career. I need you to turn around right now and march back out those doors before you do damage to the reputation I built." I did not flinch. I did not step back or lower my gaze. I stood perfectly straight, tapping into the military bearing that had sustained me through the most grueling moments of my career. I looked at the veins bulging in his neck. I looked at the sweat beading on his forehead. He was terrified. He was absolutely petrified that the people in this room would realize his family was not flawless. I told him quietly my presence here was not a personal attack on him or Chelsea or their carefully constructed social image. I reminded him I had every right to get a simple glass of cold water before sitting in the humid, empty tent they had banished me to for the evening. I told him I would return to my assigned seat when I was ready, and not a single second before he dictated. "You are just jealous," he spat. "You are completely eaten up by jealousy because Chelsea is marrying into real money, and you are going back to a barracks somewhere. You could not handle the fact that today is entirely about her. You just had to put on your flashy white suit and parade around so people would look at you instead. It is pathetic, Rebecca. You are 34 years old and you still act like an attention-seeking child. I want you out of this building immediately. If I see you inside this hall again, I will have the catering staff call the police and have you cited for trespassing. You are done trying to ruin this family." I set my glass down on the polished marble counter and stared directly through him. I told him I understood his priorities perfectly. I turned my back to his angry face and began the slow walk back to the heavy glass doors, ready to hold the line in the quiet, sweltering shadows of the overflow tent, waiting for the storm to arrive. Before my hand could even touch the brass handle of the heavy glass doors, my mother intercepted me. Patricia appeared from the adjoining hallway like a heat-seeking missile. Her designer gown rustled sharply as she marched across the marble floor. She grabbed my upper arm with a grip that was entirely too tight for a mother welcoming her daughter home. Her long, manicured fingernails dug into the crisp white fabric of my uniform sleeve. She did not look at my face. Her eyes were darting frantically around the grand foyer, making sure none of the hedge fund executives or high society wives were watching this exchange. She yanked me away from the exit doors and dragged me toward the western wing of the country club. I could have easily broken her grip. I had the training and the physical strength to drop her to the floor in a fraction of a second, but I simply let her pull me along. I wanted to see exactly how far they were willing to go to protect their fragile social climbing aesthetic. Patricia marched me down a long arched corridor that led directly into the main ceremony hall. The ceremony space was a breathtaking display of excessive unearned wealth. The vaulted ceilings were draped in miles of sheer white silk and imported crystal chandeliers. Hundreds of gilded chairs were lined up in perfect symmetrical rows, facing an altar that looked like it belonged in a royal palace. The entire room smelled overwhelmingly of fresh orchids and expensive vanilla candles. Professional videographers were already setting up their heavy camera equipment on tripods, adjusting their lighting umbrellas to capture every perfect manufactured angle of the upcoming nuptials. Photographers buzzed around the front rows, snapping candid pictures of Preston wealthy relatives who were taking their assigned seats. My mother did not lead me down the center aisle. She dragged me along the far outer wall, clinging to the shadows, where the lighting was deliberately dim. We reached the very back corner of the massive hall. This area was clearly not intended for guests. It was a dead space located behind a towering structural column that had been completely encased in a massive cascading floral arrangement. Thousands of white hydrangeas and pale pink roses formed a solid, impenetrable wall of vegetation. My father Richard appeared silently behind us, having followed my mother from the lobby. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Patricia, effectively boxing me into the dark corner behind the floral pillar. The thick wall of flowers completely obstructed my view of the altar, and more importantly, it completely obstructed the room view of me. Patricia let go of my arm and smoothed the front of her expensive dress. She pointed a trembling finger at the small patch of shadow behind the flowers. "You will stand exactly right here," she commanded, her voice a vicious whisper. "The overflow tent is currently filled with the catering staff preparing the appetizers, and I will not have you distracting the hired help. You are going to stay right here behind this arrangement until the entire ceremony is over. You will not step one single inch out of this corner. You will not let the cameras capture your face. You will not let Preston Mother see that tacky white suit you insist on wearing." Richard leaned in close, his face twisted into a mask of pure contempt. He looked at the gold buttons on my jacket and the colorful ribbon rack resting over my heart. He did not see a daughter who had just returned from an 8-month classified deployment. He did not see an officer who had risked her life for her country. He only saw an inconvenience. He saw a threat to his carefully curated image of upper-class perfection. "Stop being a disappointment and stay out of the way," he sneered. His words dripped with a toxic, familiar hatred. "For once in your miserable life, Rebecca, do exactly what you are told. Do not ruin your sister day because you are desperate for attention. You are a failure in the real world, and you are a failure to this family. Stay hidden where you belong." I looked at my parents standing there in the shadows of the country club. They looked so pathetic in their expensive clothes and their desperate need for validation from strangers. They thought their harsh words were cutting me down to size. They thought they were punishing me by putting me in the corner like a disobedient child. They did not understand that their insults no longer carried any weight. I had spent the last 240 days commanding intelligence operations that dismantled terrorist networks. I had earned the absolute respect of the most elite warfighters on the planet. The petty cruelties of a narcissistic mother and a cowardly father were nothing more than background noise. I did not argue with them. I did not defend my honor or demand a seat in the front row. I simply offered them a curt nod, acknowledging their instructions. I took a step back, moving deeper into the shadows behind the towering wall of white hydrangeas. My parents exchanged a smug, victorious look. They turned around and walked briskly down the side aisle, heading toward their prime seats at the very front of the room, ready to play the role of the perfect, loving parents for the cameras. I stood perfectly still in the dim corner. The heavy floral arrangement blocked my direct line of sight to the altar, but I could see the rest of the room through the gaps in the leaves. The main hall was filling up rapidly. I watched as Preston family entered the room. They moved with a slow, arrogant entitlement, expecting the crowd to part for them. Preston father wore a custom tuxedo and a patronizing smile. He shook hands with the local politicians and the venture capitalists, acting like he owned the entire building. The irony was almost humorous. These people considered themselves the masters of the universe because they manipulated numbers on a screen. They believed their wealth made them untouchable. They had absolutely no concept of the brutal, violent reality that existed outside their gated communities. They had no idea what it took to secure the freedom they enjoyed so casually. I maintained my military bearing. I kept my feet shoulder-width apart and my hands resting naturally at my sides. My posture was rigid and unyielding. The physical discipline grounded me. I focused on my breathing, inhaling the overpowering scent of the expensive flowers that were meant to be my prison. I watched my parents take their seats in the front row. Patricia was already dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, performing for the videographer whose camera was pointed directly at her. Richard was shaking hands with the guests seated behind him, beaming with false pride. They were putting on a masterful performance. They were selling the illusion of a flawless, loving family to the highest bidders in the room. The temperature in the corner was stifling. The massive floral structure blocked the air conditioning vents, leaving the air thick and stagnant. It reminded me of the oppressive heat in the Tactical Operations Center during my last deployment. But in the desert, that heat was shared among a team of professionals working toward a common goal. Here in this luxurious country club, the heat was just a byproduct of my deliberate isolation. I was a ghost in my own family, a specter they wanted to ignore, so they could pretend their golden child was their only legacy. I looked down at my pristine white uniform. The fabric was immaculate, reflecting the dim light of the corner. I reached up and lightly touched the surface of the ribbons on my chest. Each one carried a heavy story, a story of sacrifice, loss, and profound brotherhood. My parents called them tacky. They called them a cry for attention. They could never comprehend the blood and sweat required to earn even the lowest decoration on my rack. I watched the string quartet tuning their instruments near the front of the hall. The musicians wore elegant black suits and moved with graceful precision. Everything in the room was orchestrated to project an image of serene, flawless beauty. But beneath the surface, it was a rotten foundation. The wedding was entirely financed by stolen money and manipulation. The bride was a spoiled, entitled bully who had just intentionally ruined a bridesmaid dress out of pure malice. The parents of the bride were emotional abusers who gaslighted their oldest daughter to protect their fragile social standing. The groom was an arrogant hedge fund manager who sneered at the working class. It was a collection of the most toxic, self-serving individuals imaginable gathered together to celebrate their own vanity. I shifted my weight slightly, making sure my boots made no sound against the marble floor. A waiter in a crisp white shirt and black vest hurried past my corner carrying a tray of champagne flutes. He briefly made eye contact with me. I saw the sudden confusion register on his face as he noticed a fully decorated naval officer standing in the shadows behind a flower arrangement. I offered him a slight reassuring nod. He blinked quickly, averted his eyes, and rushed away toward the front of the room. It was easier for everyone to pretend I was not there. It was easier to look away from the uncomfortable truth. I was the inconvenient reality they all wanted to avoid. I was the physical embodiment of duty and honor standing in a room entirely devoid of both. The low murmur of hundreds of guests filled the grand hall, creating a steady drone of polite conversation. I could hear snippets of their discussions drifting into my corner. They were talking about golf handicaps, offshore accounts, and summer homes in the Hamptons. They were complaining about the stock market and exchanging rumors about corporate mergers. There was not a single genuine sentiment being expressed. Every word was calculated to impress or intimidate. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the hollow, superficial noise. I contrasted it with the voices of my unit. I thought about the sharp, clear communication over the tactical radios, the fierce, unwavering loyalty in the voices of the men who trusted me with their lives, the dark, honest humor we shared after a grueling mission. The bond I had with my military family was stronger than anything these wealthy socialites would ever experience. My biological family had successfully pushed me into the dark. They had physically and metaphorically banished me to the background. They believed they held all the power because they controlled the guest list and the seating chart. They believed they could dictate my worth by demanding I stay out of the way. But they were fundamentally mistaken about the nature of power. True power did not come from wealth or social status or the ability to intimidate someone into a dark corner. True power came from resilience, integrity, and the unwavering support of people who genuinely had your back. As I stood behind the towering wall of white hydrangeas listening to the string quartet begin to play the prelude, I felt an overwhelming sense of calm wash over me. I was not a disappointment. I was a survivor. I was a highly decorated officer in the United States Navy, and I was exactly where I needed to be. I was holding the line in the shadows, watching the grand illusion play out, waiting for the inevitable moment when the truth would finally break through the heavy oak doors of the country club. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall remained closed for now, keeping the summer heat and the reality of the outside world firmly at bay. I kept my gaze fixed on the small sliver of the aisle I could see through the leaves. I knew Chelsea was somewhere upstairs, likely throwing a tantrum about her makeup, or demanding more champagne from her terrified bridesmaids. I knew my mother was gripping her lace handkerchief, ready to produce fake tears the moment the cameras turned her way. I knew my father was mentally calculating the net worth of every person sitting in the front rows. They were all playing their assigned roles in this massive theatrical production. They had assigned me the role of the invisible failure, the shameful secret hidden behind the flowers. I accepted the role with silent, steely resolve. I did not need to fight them for a seat at their table because I already knew their table was entirely corrupt. I stood tall in the darkness, my uniform a crisp, bright shield against their toxicity. I breathed in the suffocating scent of the roses and hydrangeas, locking away the hurt and the rejection. I was completely isolated in a room full of hundreds of people, but I did not feel alone. I knew my real family was out there, and I knew with absolute certainty that they would never leave a sister behind. The string quartet shifted seamlessly from a soft prelude into the traditional wedding march. The tempo slowed and the heavy oak doors at the front of the main hall finally swung wide open. I watched through the narrow gaps in the white hydrangeas as the bridesmaids began their procession. They walked in perfect synchronization, wearing the pale peach silk dresses my mother had so carefully selected. They moved like clockwork, gliding down the center aisle with practiced smiles. Following them were Preston groomsmen. They were all young, aggressive hedge fund managers wearing identical custom tuxedos and expensive watches. They carried themselves with an unearned swagger, looking over the seated guests with smug approval. The entire production was flawless. Patricia had orchestrated every single second of this event to project absolute perfection. I stood in my designated corner, breathing in the heavy scent of crushed flower petals and expensive perfume. The physical separation between my dark corner and the brightly lit altar felt like a massive canyon. I was less than 50 feet away from my biological family, but we existed in entirely different universes. The videographers circled the aisle, capturing every tear and every smile, ensuring no trace of imperfection ruined the footage. They did not point their lenses anywhere near the back wall. My mother had clearly given them strict instructions regarding the camera angles. I remained perfectly still, letting the shadows swallow my white uniform. The music swelled, signaling the arrival of the bride. The guests rose to their feet in a collective wave of rustling silk and murmuring voices. Chelsea appeared at the threshold holding onto our father arm. She wore a gown that easily cost more than my first year of college tuition. It was covered in imported lace and thousands of hand-sewn crystals that caught the light of the chandeliers. She paused at the top of the aisle, soaking in the collective attention of the room. This was the exact moment she had craved her entire life. She was the absolute center of the universe, surrounded by wealth and power and undivided focus. Richard looked like he might burst with pride. His chest was puffed out, and he offered a magnanimous nod to the venture capitalists sitting in the front rows. He walked her down the aisle, delivering his golden child directly into the waiting hands of an elite financial dynasty. I watched them pass, oblivious to my presence in the back. The disrespect was a tangible physical thing in the room. It hung in the air, thicker than the humidity outside. They had completely erased me from the narrative. When the officiant took his place at the altar, he began speaking into a sleek microphone. His voice echoed through the vaulted ceilings, praising the beautiful union of two prominent families. He spoke about loyalty and the unbreakable bonds of kinship. He praised Richard and Patricia for raising such a radiant, successful daughter. He used the singular form of the word, daughter. It was a deliberate omission. They had briefed the officiant to completely write me out of the script. The hypocrisy was staggering. I listened to the officiant talk about the unwavering support of family, while I stood banished behind a structural pillar because my military service did not fit their color palette. The heat in the corner was becoming increasingly oppressive. The massive floral arrangement acted like an insulator, trapping the warm air around me. A bead of sweat formed at the nape of my neck and rolled slowly down my spine beneath my heavy uniform jacket. I did not wipe it away. I maintained my rigid posture, keeping my hands clasped loosely in front of me. I treated the situation like a surveillance operation. I observed the tactical layout of the room. I noted the exits, the security personnel stationed by the doors, and the blind spots in the camera coverage. I watched the wealthy guests fanning themselves with embossed programs, completely captivated by the elaborate performance. A few members of the catering staff moved quietly along the back wall, refilling water glasses and carrying empty trays. One of them brushed past my shoulder, accidentally stepping on the toe of my polished black boot. He whispered a quick apology without even looking up at my face, assuming I was just another hired hand waiting for instructions. I did not correct him. I just gave a curt nod and remained a silent fixture in the architecture. The ceremony progressed into the exchange of vows. Preston took a small microphone and began reciting a lengthy speech about how Chelsea was his equal partner in conquering the corporate world. He talked about their shared vision for the future and their mutual ambition. He sounded like he was pitching a merger to a board of directors rather than declaring his love to his future wife. Chelsea wiped a single careful tear from her cheek, making sure not to smudge her professional makeup. She replied with her own vows, focusing heavily on their luxurious travels and their high society lifestyle. Patricia was openly weeping in the front row, dabbing her eyes while Richard patted her shoulder consolingly. I watched the entire display with clinical detachment. I did not feel angry anymore. The burning rage I had felt in the bridal suite had completely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. I looked at these people, and I only felt profound pity. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, constantly performing for an audience of peers who would abandon them the second their bank accounts dipped. They measured their entire self-worth by the designer labels they wore and the exclusive addresses they occupied. They knew absolutely nothing about real sacrifice or unconditional loyalty. As the officiant asked for the rings, I shifted my weight slightly. My legs were growing stiff from standing in the exact same position for nearly 30 minutes. The silence in the room was absolute as Preston's best man stepped forward to hand over the rings. The guests held their breath, waiting for the climactic moment of the ceremony. That was when I felt it. A sharp, distinct vibration against my right thigh. It was a single long pulse followed by two short ones. It was the specific vibration pattern I had programmed into my encrypted phone for high-priority communications. I did not immediately reach for my pocket. I maintained my forward gaze, keeping my head perfectly level. I waited for a moment when the videographers panned their cameras toward the altar, shifting their lenses away from the back walls. I slowly moved my right hand down and slipped my fingers into the deep pocket of my trousers. I gripped the smooth metal edge of the device and pulled it out, keeping it concealed against my side. I turned slightly, angling my body so the glow of the screen would be completely hidden by the thick leaves of the hydrangea arrangement. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner, and the screen illuminated instantly. It was a text message routed through a secure military server. The sender was listed only by a call sign. It was my commanding officer. The message was incredibly brief. It consisted of exactly 2 sentences. ETA 5 minutes. Hold the line. I stared at the glowing white text on the dark screen. The words burned themselves into my retinas. A sudden rush of adrenaline flooded my system, pushing away the heat and the fatigue. The calm before the storm was officially over. I locked the screen and slid the phone back into my pocket. My hands were no longer clasped loosely in front of me. They were curled into tight fists at my sides. I squared my shoulders and adjusted my stance, shifting into a posture of absolute readiness. I looked through the gaps in the flowers, staring directly at the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall. I was no longer a banished daughter hiding in the shadows. I was an active duty officer awaiting the arrival of my command. I took a deep, steadying breath and braced myself for the breach. The string quartet sitting near the front of the altar smoothly transitioned their melody. The gentle prelude shifted into the grand, sweeping chords of the traditional wedding march. The sound filled the massive vaulted ceiling of the country club, echoing off the imported crystal chandeliers and the stone pillars. Every single guest in the room stood up in perfect unison. There was a loud rustling of expensive silk and tailored wool as hundreds of local elite turned their bodies toward the center aisle. They were entirely captivated by the spectacle my parents had purchased for them. Patricia was practically vibrating with excitement in the front row. She clutched her lace handkerchief to her chest, making sure the professional videographer was capturing her perfectly manufactured tears of joy. Richard stood tall beside her, projecting the image of a proud, triumphant patriarch who had successfully merged his bloodline with a billionaire dynasty. Chelsea began her final procession toward the altar. Her grip on her oversized bouquet of white orchids was incredibly tight. She moved with agonizing slowness, dragging out every single second of the attention. Her massive crystal-covered train snagged slightly on the thick carpet, but she maintained her arrogant, beaming smile. Preston waited for her at the front. He adjusted the cuffs of his custom Italian tuxedo and shot a smug, victorious look toward his wealthy groomsmen. He looked less like a man about to marry the love of his life and more like a corporate raider closing a highly profitable acquisition. The atmosphere in the room was suffocatingly artificial. It was a flawless performance executed by people who cared only about status and perception. From my dark hidden corner behind the towering wall of white hydrangeas, I watched this display of vanity with absolute stillness. My phone remained safely locked in my pocket. The 5-minute countdown initiated by my commanding officer was ticking away in my mind. I synchronized my breathing with the slow, heavy tempo of the cello. Inhale for 3 seconds. Exhale for 3 seconds. It was the same tactical breathing technique I used during classified extractions in hostile territories. It slowed my heart rate and heightened my sensory awareness. I noticed the slightest shift in the air pressure of the grand hall. I noticed the way the heavy velvet curtains near the rear exits swayed just a fraction of an inch. Something massive was moving on the other side of those walls. The wedding planner was stationed near the back of the room, just a few yards away from my floral prison. She was a high-strung woman, wearing a sharp black suit and a headset with a coiled clear earpiece. She held a clipboard against her chest like a shield. She was frantically tapping her foot, completely absorbed in the timing of the ceremony. She nodded to her assistant, signaling that the procession was perfectly on schedule. She believed she had total control over the environment. She believed the doors were locked, the security was tight, and the aesthetic was secured. She was completely oblivious to the tactical force that was rapidly assembling just beyond the country club threshold. The heavy oak doors at the back of the grand hall were magnificent structures. They were 10 feet tall, constructed from solid wood and reinforced with heavy iron hinges. They were designed to remain firmly shut during exclusive private events, keeping the outside world strictly separated from the high society bubble inside. As Chelsea reached the midway point of the center aisle, a distinct sound cut through the elegant music of the string quartet. It was not a loud crash or a chaotic disruption. It was the sharp, heavy metallic click of the main exterior latch disengaging. It was a precise, deliberate sound. The wedding planner head snapped toward the back of the room immediately. Her eyes widened in sheer panic. She pressed her hand against her earpiece, whispering furiously into her microphone. She demanded to know why the rear perimeter security had allowed anyone into the main lobby area during the bridal march. I watched her face drain of color as she received no response from her radio. The hired private security guards my father had paid a premium for were completely silent. The country club staff had been neutralized. The wedding planner dropped her clipboard onto a nearby side table. She sprinted toward the solid oak doors, her high heels clicking frantically against the polished marble floor. She threw her entire body weight against the heavy wooden panels, pressing her hands flat against the polished oak. She was desperately trying to hold them shut. She looked over her shoulder, terrified that the wealthy guests or my furious mother would notice the disruption at the back of the room. She knew my parents would destroy her business reputation if any uninvited guests ruined the wedding aesthetic. She pushed with all her might, her black suit jacket wrinkling under the strain. It was a futile gesture. She was a single civilian attempting to physically block a highly coordinated tactical breach. The handles of the massive oak doors began to turn simultaneously. The movement was slow and incredibly steady, projecting an aura of unstoppable force. The wedding planner dug the heels of her shoes into the marble floor, trying to find leverage. "Please," she hissed, her voice a desperate, panicked whisper directed at the crack between the doors. "You cannot enter this space. This is a closed, private event. The ceremony has already commenced. You need to return to the lobby immediately." Her frantic commands were met with absolute dead silence. There was no argument from the other side. There was no raised voice demanding entry. There was only the continuous steady pressure against the wood. The heavy iron hinges let out a low, metallic groan. The wedding planner was physically pushed backward. Her rubber soles slid across the polished marble as the massive oak panels were forced inward. She stumbled, struggling to maintain her balance. She reached out and grabbed the edge of a nearby floral stand, nearly knocking over a tall vase of expensive white lilies. The door swung open, revealing the bright fluorescent light of the country club lobby, contrasting sharply with the dim romantic lighting of the ceremony hall. The sheer physical presence occupying the threshold was staggering. The wedding planner scrambled to her feet. She threw her arms out wide in a last desperate attempt to form a human barricade. She positioned herself directly in the center of the double doorway. She opened her mouth to shout for the hired security detail, but the words completely died in her throat. She froze, staring up at the figures entering the room. The men stepping over the threshold did not look like confused, lost guests or disgruntled catering staff. They possessed a terrifying, synchronized bearing. They moved with a silent, calculated efficiency that instantly commanded the space. The wedding planner lowered her arms slowly. The aggressive, authoritative stance she used to bully florists and photographers completely evaporated. She backed away, her shoulders shrinking as she retreated until her back hit the wall next to the entryway. She watched with wide, terrified eyes as her human barricade was entirely ignored. The intruders bypassed the trembling woman without a single glance in her direction. They did not push her. They did not threaten her. They simply stepped past her with the cold professional detachment of a unit executing a highly disciplined operation. They treated her frantic attempts to block the door exactly like what they were: a minor, irrelevant obstacle in the path of a fully authorized mission. The heavy oak doors were pushed back until they locked into the open position. The physical barrier between my toxic high society family and my actual brotherhood was officially removed. The guests seated in the back rows of the venue began to notice the shift in the atmosphere. The temperature near the entrance dropped as the cool air from the lobby flooded into the humid, crowded hall. A few venture capitalists sitting near the aisle turned their heads frowning in irritation at the sudden influx of light and movement. Their annoyed expressions quickly morphed into looks of profound confusion. They lowered their expensive silk programs. The low murmur of whispers started at the rear of the room and began spreading forward like a ripple across a dark pond. Chelsea was nearing the altar now. Her eyes were fixed on Preston. She was completely unaware that the perfect, flawless aesthetic my parents had purchased was actively being dismantled just 100 feet behind her. Patricia was still dabbing her dry eyes, completely focused on the camera lens. Richard was still projecting his arrogant dominance. They had banished me to the dark corner behind the floral pillar, believing they had secured total control over the narrative of the day. From my hidden vantage point, I watched the breach unfold with crystal clarity. My pulse remained steady, but a fierce, undeniable pride flared in my chest. The agonizing isolation of the last 48 hours vanished entirely. My father had mocked my service. My mother had treated my uniform like a shameful costume. They had tried to erase my existence to impress a room full of arrogant strangers. But the waiting game was finally over. The line I had been holding in the shadows was about to be heavily reinforced. The string quartet continued to play their elegant sweeping chords, completely unaware that the tempo of the room no longer belonged to them. The breach was successful, and the true command of the venue had just arrived. The first man stepped across the threshold. He wore the immaculate uniform of the United States Navy. His crisp white trousers and tailored jacket cut a sharp silhouette against the soft, romantic lighting of the country club. The gold buttons on his chest caught the light of the crystal chandeliers, reflecting it back with a hard metallic glare. He did not walk like a guest searching for a seat. He moved with the measured predatory grace of an apex predator, entering an unfamiliar environment. Behind him came another, then another. They poured through the open oak doors like a rising tide of white fabric and absolute discipline. This was not a small honor guard or a token military representation. This was an overwhelming show of force. 300 active-duty Navy SEALs and Special Operations support staff flowed into the Grand Hall. They did not march in a parade formation. There were no shouted commands or rhythmic stomping of boots. They executed a tactical deployment into a civilian space with terrifying silent precision. They moved shoulder to shoulder, dividing seamlessly at the entrance to fan out across the entire venue. One column of men peeled off to the left, marching quietly along the heavy velvet curtains that covered the towering windows. Another column broke to the right, securing the opposite flank of the room. They walked with their spines perfectly straight and their eyes locked forward. Their faces were carved from stone, betraying absolutely zero emotion. They were not smiling at the beautiful floral arrangements. They were not admiring the imported silk drapery. They were scanning the room, assessing the layout, and establishing a perimeter with clinical efficiency. The only sound was the synchronized muffled tread of 300 pairs of polished dress shoes stepping in perfect unison across the marble floors. The wealthy guests seated in the back rows were the first to fully register the invasion. A venture capitalist sitting near the aisle actually dropped his embossed program onto the floor. The heavy paper landed with a soft thud that sounded incredibly loud in the shifting atmosphere. The woman sitting next to him, a socialite draped in diamonds, clutched her expensive purse against her chest. Her mouth fell open in a silent gasp. They twisted in their gilded chairs, staring in absolute shock as dozens of massive battle-hardened operators walked past them. These were men who had spent their entire adult lives operating in the most dangerous, hostile environments on the planet. They possessed a physical presence that simply could not be bought with offshore accounts or inherited wealth. Their shoulders were impossibly broad, stretching the seams of their tailored dress jackets. Their hands were large and calloused, resting casually but securely at their sides. The operators continued their silent progression, moving further down the aisles. They positioned themselves at exact intervals along the outer walls. They formed a solid, unbroken perimeter of white uniforms, enclosing the entire wedding ceremony within a ring of military power. A group of heavily decorated chief petty officers moved directly toward the emergency exits flanking the doors and standing at parade rest. They crossed their hands behind their backs and widened their stances. In a matter of seconds, they had completely locked down the room. No one was leaving and no one else was entering. The country club had been entirely commandeered. As they passed under the bright lights of the chandeliers, the most intimidating detail of their arrival became visible. Pinned directly above the colorful ribbon racks on their left breast pockets was the special warfare insignia, the golden trident. The eagle holding the anchor, the trident, and the flintlock pistol. It was the universal symbol of the most elite maritime commando force in the world. 300 golden tridents gleamed in the dim romantic lighting of the country club. The sheer concentration of lethal capability in one room was staggering. The hedge fund managers and corporate executives who had spent the entire afternoon boasting about their ruthless business tactics suddenly looked incredibly small and insignificant. Their expensive, tailored suits looked like cheap costumes compared to the heavy weight of the military decorations surrounding them. The low murmur of confusion that had started at the back of the room quickly escalated into a wave of palpable anxiety. Whispers hissed through the rows of gilded chairs. The guests were leaning toward each other, asking frantic questions. They demanded to know if this was a planned part of the ceremony. They speculated wildly about security threats or government raids. Preston's wealthy relatives sitting in the VIP section began to shift uncomfortably. The mother of the groom pulled her silk wrap tighter around her shoulders, throwing alarmed glances at the rigid, unmoving sentinels lining the walls. The noise level in the grand hall steadily rose, completely overpowering the delicate music of the string quartet. The musicians sitting near the front of the altar were oblivious at first. They kept their eyes glued to their sheet music, focused entirely on executing the bridal march. But as the wall of white uniforms advanced further down the side aisles, the cellist finally looked up. His bow faltered, scraping harshly against the strings. The sudden discordant screech caused the violinist to turn around. She gasped, lowering her instrument entirely. One by one, the musicians stopped playing. The beautiful, sweeping melody of the wedding march unraveled into a chaotic, disorganized silence, leaving only the sound of anxious whispers filling the cavernous room. Chelsea was standing just 10 feet away from Preston at the altar. She had been taking agonizingly slow steps, basking in the manufactured glow of her perfect day. When the music died, she froze. She kept her artificial smile plastered on her face, assuming the quartet had simply paused for dramatic effect. She waited for the crescendo that would carry her the rest of the way down the aisle. But the crescendo never came. Instead, she heard the heavy rustling of 300 uniforms settling into position. She heard the frantic whispers of her elite guests. She realized with a sudden jolt of panic that absolutely no one in the room was looking at her anymore. The cameras were no longer focused on her imported lace gown. The wealthy relatives were no longer shedding tears of joy over her beauty. Every single head in the grand hall was turned toward the perimeter walls, staring in shock at the invading force of military operators. Patricia sat in the front row, her lace handkerchief suspended halfway to her face. She twisted around in her seat, her eyes wide with mounting horror. She saw the men standing at parade rest along the walls. She saw the gold tridents and the stark white fabric. Her perfectly contoured face drained of all color. She recognized the uniforms immediately. She knew exactly what branch of the military they represented, but her mind completely failed to comprehend why an entire battalion of special operations personnel had just crashed her high society event. She looked frantically toward the back of the room, desperately searching the shadows behind the floral pillar where she had banished me. She could not see me through the thick wall of hydrangeas, but I could see her. I saw the absolute terror gripping her chest as her flawless aesthetic was aggressively dismantled by the very institution she had mocked. Richard was standing near the altar, having just released Chelsea's arm. He looked out over the crowd, his arrogant posture instantly crumbling. He watched the final group of operators take their positions near the front rows. These were men who radiated an aura of dangerous, unyielding authority. They did not break their forward gaze. They did not acknowledge the gasps or the whispers. They stood like marble statues, forming an impenetrable barrier around the seated guests. Richard's face turned a violent shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged against the tight collar of his tuxedo. He felt his dominance slipping away. He had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to create an environment where he was the undisputed king, and within 60 seconds he had been reduced to a helpless bystander in his own production. He gripped the edge of the nearest wooden pew, his knuckles turning white, as he stared at the men surrounding him. Preston stood at the altar, his smug, victorious smirk completely erased. He looked at the massive chief petty officer standing just a few yards away from him. The chief was a mountain of a man with a thick beard and scars visible along his jawline. Preston tried to puff out his chest and project confidence, but his attempt was utterly pathetic. He looked like a frightened child playing dress-up. The chief did not even blink. He stared straight ahead, looking right through the wealthy hedge fund manager, as if he were made of glass. The psychological intimidation was absolute. The SEALs did not need to draw weapons or raise their voices to conquer the room. Their sheer presence, their unbreakable discipline, and their undeniable brotherhood commanded absolute submission from everyone present. From my dark corner behind the massive floral arrangement, I watched the deployment with fierce, overwhelming pride. The stifling heat of the overflow tent and the humiliating insults of my parents washed away completely. I was no longer the outcast sister hiding in the shadows. I was surrounded by my people. I felt the familiar comforting weight of my own uniform. I felt the gold oak leaves on my collar and the ribbon rack on my chest. I saw my brothers in arms standing shoulder to shoulder, forming a shield wall around the perimeter of the room. They had left their bases, their homes, and their families on a Saturday afternoon to travel to a civilian country club for one single purpose. They had come to hold the line for one of their own, and they had secured the perimeter with absolute terrifying perfection. The initial shock that had frozen Richard at the altar was rapidly replaced by a volcanic, irrational fury. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life buying control, silencing opposition with heavy checkbooks and aggressive lawyers. He could not comprehend a situation where his authority was completely negated. His face turned a deep mottled crimson. He shoved past a row of stunned guests, his polished dress shoes stomping aggressively against the marble floor. Preston, unwilling to look weak in front of his billionaire father and grandfather, quickly followed suit. The groom adjusted his custom silk tie and marched closely behind his father-in-law, attempting to project a united front of corporate dominance. They stormed down the center aisle, leaving Chelsea standing completely alone at the altar. She clutched her massive bouquet of white orchids, her mouth hanging open in a very unphotogenic display of confusion. The videographers, sensing the dramatic shift in the room energy, instinctively pivoted their expensive cameras away from the abandoned bride and focused their lenses directly on the impending collision at the back of the grand hall. As Richard and Preston closed the distance, the sheer physical discrepancy between the two groups became almost comical. Richard and Preston were wealthy, manicured men who spent their days in climate-controlled corner offices. They paid personal trainers to keep them fit for golf tournaments. The men they were marching toward were elite maritime commandos. The SEALs lining the rear perimeter were massive, broad-shouldered operators who had forged their bodies in the most unforgiving environments on Earth. They stood in perfect, terrifying stillness. They did not shift their weight. They did not adjust their pristine white uniforms. They watched the two angry civilians approach with the clinical, detached observation of predators tracking a very small, very loud prey. Richard reached the rear of the hall and stopped a few feet away from the heavy oak doors. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his tailored tuxedo jacket. He glared at the wall of white uniforms, his eyes darting frantically from face to face, searching for someone who looked like they were in charge. The guests in the back rows shrank down in their gilded chairs, trying to distance themselves from the brewing confrontation. The silence in the room was absolute, magnifying the harsh, jagged sound of Richard's angry breathing. "Who is in charge here?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking slightly before he forced it into a loud, booming shout. He pointed a trembling finger at the closest operator. I demand to know who gave the authorization for this stunt. This is a private, highly exclusive event. You are trespassing on private property, and you are completely ruining a multi-million-dollar wedding ceremony. The SEAL did not respond. He did not even blink. He maintained a perfectly neutral gaze, staring straight through Richard, as if the furious corporate executive did not exist. The lack of reaction only fueled Richard's rage. He was entirely accustomed to people cowering when he raised his voice. He was used to waitstaff apologizing and subordinates scrambling to appease him. The absolute silence from the military personnel felt like a physical slap to his face. I am speaking to you, Richard yelled, taking an aggressive step forward. Do you have any idea who is in this room? We have state senators sitting in the front rows. We have the executives of the largest hedge funds in the country. You do not just kick open the doors and crash an event of this magnitude. I want you to turn around, march your men out of my venue, and get off this property immediately before I call the local authorities and have every single one of you arrested for criminal trespassing. Preston stepped up beside his father-in-law, attempting to bolster the threat. He crossed his arms over his chest and adopted a smug, condescending sneer. Listen to me very carefully, Preston said, utilizing the arrogant tone he reserved for underperforming analysts. You guys clearly think this is some kind of funny prank, but you are playing with fire. My family owns a significant portion of the real estate in this county, including the land this country club sits on. I have the chief of police on speed dial. If you do not pack up this tacky security stunt and vacate the premises in exactly 30 seconds, I will personally guarantee that you are all court-martialed. I will tie you up in civil litigation for the rest of your miserable lives. From my dark corner behind the towering floral arrangement, I watched the confrontation with a cold, analytical focus. I wanted to laugh at Preston's absolute delusion. He believed his offshore bank accounts and his country club memberships carried weight against the United States Special Operations Command. He was threatening to sue men who jumped out of airplanes into hostile war zones at 3 a.m. He was threatening to arrest operators who hunted international terrorists for a living. The absolute sheer arrogance of his threat was staggering. The operators lining the walls remained entirely unfazed by the legal threats and the aggressive posturing. They had faced down warlords, insurgents, and enemy combatants who carried loaded weapons. Two angry men in expensive suits yelling about civil litigation did not even register on their threat assessment radar. They stood at parade rest, their hands clasped firmly behind their backs, projecting a wall of unbreakable discipline. The tension in the air grew thick enough to choke on. Richard and Preston stood there, their chests puffed out, waiting for the military men to apologize and retreat. They waited for the authority they believed they possessed to finally take effect. But the retreat never came. Instead, the ranks of the white uniforms shifted. The movement was incredibly smooth and coordinated. The operators flanking the main center aisle took a synchronized half-step backward, creating a clear, unobstructed path. A single figure stepped forward into the open space. He was a Master Chief Petty Officer, and he possessed a physical presence that immediately dominated the entire room. He was easily 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders that seemed impossibly broad under the crisp white fabric of his jacket. His chest was covered in colorful ribbons topped with the gleaming gold trident of naval special warfare. A thick, neatly trimmed beard covered his jaw, and a pale, jagged scar ran from his left temple down to his collar. He did not look like a man who attended high society galas. He looked like a man who tore down gates and survived the fires of hell. The Master Chief walked slowly toward Richard and Preston. His black dress shoes made sharp, distinct clicks against the marble floor. He stopped exactly 2 feet away from my father. The height difference was severe, forcing Richard to crane his neck upward to make eye contact. The Master Chief looked down at the two furious civilians. He did not look angry. He did not look intimidated. He looked at them with a terrifying, absolute calm. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing against his tight bow tie. He tried to maintain his aggressive stance, but his confidence was rapidly bleeding out onto the floor. "You," Richard stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the giant operator. "Are you the one in charge of this ridiculous display? I demand that you remove your men. I demand that you explain what you are doing crashing my daughter's wedding." The Master Chief let Richard finish his frantic demands. He let the silence stretch out for a long, agonizing moment, allowing the heavy weight of his presence to crush the remaining air out of my father's lungs. The wealthy guests seated nearby held their collective breath, completely mesmerized by the confrontation. Patricia was gripping the edge of her seat in the front row, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into the gilded wood. Chelsea was still frozen at the altar, her face a mask of pale, furious shock. When the Master Chief finally spoke, his voice was not loud. He did not yell or raise his tone to match Richard's frantic energy. His voice was a deep, resonant rumble that carried effortlessly across the silent hall. It was a voice accustomed to issuing commands in the middle of a chaotic firefight. It was a voice that demanded absolute, unquestioning obedience. "You are deeply confused about the nature of our presence here," the Master Chief said slowly, his tone dropping the temperature of the room to freezing. "We are not a security stunt. We do not answer to your police chief, and we certainly do not care about your real estate portfolio." Richard opened his mouth to argue, attempting to summon another threat, but the Master Chief stepped 1 inch closer. The sheer physical intimidation of the movement forced Richard to instinctively take a step back, his polished shoe catching on the edge of the aisle runner. Preston retreated as well, his smug smirk completely vanishing, replaced by genuine naked fear. The hedge fund manager realized far too late that he had picked a fight with a force he could not buy, bribe, or litigate away. "You demanded to know why we walked through those doors?" The Master Chief continued, his cold, piercing eyes locking directly onto my father's terrified face. He did not blink. He stared straight into Richard's soul, stripping away all the corporate bravado and exposing the cowardice underneath. "You assume we are here to ruin your perfect little party. You assume we care about your high society status. Let me correct your monumental misunderstanding right now." The Master Chief squared his massive shoulders. His voice echoed off the imported crystal chandeliers and the vaulted ceilings, ringing out with undeniable, absolute authority. "We aren't here for you, sir. We are here for our sister." The words struck the room like a physical shockwave. The declaration of fierce, unbreakable brotherhood shattered the toxic, artificial atmosphere of the country club. The guests gasped in collective realization, their heads whipping around to search the perimeter. Richard's jaw went completely slack, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror as the meaning of the words finally penetrated his arrogant mind. Preston stumbled backward, bumping into a row of chairs, his face entirely devoid of color. From my dark, sweltering corner behind the massive wall of white hydrangeas, I felt a rush of profound, overwhelming emotions surge through my chest. The isolation, the cruel insults, the financial manipulation, and the years of being treated like a shameful disappointment completely dissolved into nothing. They had banished me to the shadows to protect their flawless aesthetic. They had tried to erase my existence to impress a room full of strangers. But my brothers had tracked me down in the dark. They had breached the heavy oak doors, locked down the perimeter, and publicly claimed me in front of the exact people who had spent my entire life trying to tear me down. I stood perfectly still, my pristine white uniform glowing in the dim light, waiting for the final absolute command to step out of the shadows. The Master Chief declaration hung in the stagnant air of the country club. The word "sister" echoed off the marble floors and the vaulted ceilings, striking the wealthy guests like a physical blow. Richard stood completely paralyzed. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His brain simply could not process the information. He had spent my entire life convincing himself and everyone around him that I was an isolated failure. He had built his entire arrogant identity on the belief that I was a shameful secret easily discarded and completely alone. The realization that I was flanked by the most lethal maritime commando force on the planet fundamentally broke his reality. He stared at the giant Master Chief with blank, terrified comprehension. Preston backed away from the confrontation so quickly he nearly tripped over the edge of a gilded chair. The smug hedge fund manager, who had just threatened civil litigation and police action, looked like he was about to physically be sick. His expensive custom tuxedo suddenly looked like a cheap Halloween costume. He realized with absolute horrifying clarity that his money and his local influence meant absolutely nothing to the men standing in front of him. The operators did not care about his stock portfolio or his political connections. They cared about loyalty, and they had just publicly declared their allegiance to the woman Preston's new family had banished to the shadows. The string quartet sitting near the front of the altar finally stopped playing entirely. The cellist lowered his bow with a shaking hand. The violinist placed her instrument gently on her lap, staring wide-eyed at the wall of white uniforms. The abrupt cessation of the wedding march created a vacuum in the room. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was heavier and more oppressive than any noise could have been. It was a thick, suffocating stillness. Nobody spoke. Nobody whispered. Hundreds of the most powerful corporate executives and socialites in the region held their collective breath, terrified that any sudden movement might provoke the military force surrounding them. Chelsea remained frozen at the altar. Her grip on her massive bouquet of white orchids was so tight her knuckles were completely white. The perfect manufactured smile she had been practicing for months was entirely gone, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. She looked frantically toward our parents, expecting them to fix the situation. She expected Richard to throw money at the problem, or Patricia to scream at the staff until the aesthetic was restored. But Richard was backing away from the Master Chief, and Patricia was cowering in the front row, her lace handkerchief crushed in her trembling fists. There was no one left to protect the golden child from the consequences of her own toxicity. From my concealed position behind the towering wall of white hydrangeas, I watched the psychological collapse of my biological family with cold clinical detachment. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for them. They had orchestrated their own public humiliation through their relentless cruelty and their arrogant assumption that they could treat me like garbage without any repercussions. I maintained my rigid posture, my hands curled into loose fists at my sides, waiting for the final phase of the operation to commence. My pulse was steady, but a fierce electric anticipation coursed through my veins. A sharp, distinct sound broke the absolute silence of the grand hall. It was the heavy, synchronized tread of leather shoes striking the marble floor of the lobby. The footsteps were approaching the open oak doors at the rear of the venue. The cadence was precise and unhurried, projecting an aura of immense, undeniable authority. The Master Chief, who had just confronted my father, took a swift, calculated step backward. He pivoted sharply on his heel, aligning himself perfectly with the rest of the operators forming the perimeter. The slight movement signaled a massive shift in the tactical posture of the room. The men were no longer just holding the line. They were preparing to receive their highest command. A single figure stepped into the open threshold of the heavy oak doors. He wore the crisp, immaculate uniform of a United States Navy commander. He was a man in his late 40s with a sharp, angular jawline and eyes that scanned the room with the precision of a targeting laser. He did not look at the lavish floral arrangements or the imported crystal chandeliers. He did not spare a single glance for the terrified billionaires sitting in the gilded chairs or the furious bride standing at the altar. He looked directly at the ranks of his men, ensuring the perimeter was entirely secure and the formation was flawless. The commander took a deep, measured breath, expanding his broad chest under his pristine white jacket. He squared his shoulders and locked his knees, standing at perfect, rigid attention. He raised his chin and opened his mouth. When he spoke, he did not use a microphone, but his voice possessed a raw, concussive power that absolutely did not need artificial amplification. "Admiral on deck." The shout exploded from his chest with the force of a detonating charge. The words boomed off the stone walls and the vaulted ceilings, tearing through the stagnant air of the country club. The sheer volume and absolute authority of the command vibrated in the chest cavity of every single person in the room. It was not a request for quiet. It was an uncompromising, forceful demand for absolute total respect. The sound washed over the wealthy guests, causing several of the socialites in the front rows to physically flinch and cover their ears. They had never been spoken to with such raw, unfiltered power. They were accustomed to polite suggestions and deferential requests. The commander voice shattered their pampered reality, instantly asserting a dominance that could not be challenged. The physical response from the 300 operators in the room was immediate and terrifyingly violent. The second the final syllable left the commander lips, every single Navy SEAL and Special Operations Support staff member moved as one single heavily armed organism. There was no hesitation. There was no fractional delay. 300 men executed a rigid, flawless military salute simultaneously. The sound of the movement was thunderous. It was a sharp, kinetic crack of heavy fabric snapping against muscle and bone, followed instantly by the unified concussive thud of 300 pairs of leather heels slamming together. The noise cracked through the dead, silent room like a synchronized rifle volley. It was sharp and violent and beautiful. The absolute precision of the movement showcased decades of relentless, grueling discipline. The operators stood frozen like statues carved from white marble, their right hands raised perfectly to the brims of their white service covers, their elbows locked at exact angles. They did not waver. They did not breathe. They transformed the luxurious civilian wedding venue into a hallowed military parade ground in a fraction of a second. The wealthy guests were completely paralyzed by the display. The sudden violent crack of the salute caused Patricia to let out a short, terrified shriek. She slumped back into her gilded chair, clutching her chest as if she had just been physically struck. Richard stumbled backward, his polished shoes slipping on the marble floor until his back collided hard against the edge of a wooden pew. He stared at the rigid saluting operators with wide, unblinking eyes, finally grasping the catastrophic magnitude of his mistake. He had not just insulted a lowly government worker, he had deeply and personally offended the most elite fighting force on the global stage. Preston Father, the arrogant hedge fund executive who had been sneering at the staff all evening, was completely frozen in the second row. His mouth hung open in a silent shape of pure astonishment. The illusion of his corporate invincibility had been shattered into a million pieces. He realized with absolute clarity that his wealth provided zero protection against the raw kinetic reality of the men standing along the walls. The only person in the civilian crowd who did not look terrified was Preston Grandfather. The billionaire patriarch and Vietnam veteran remained seated in the VIP section, but his posture had changed entirely. He sat perfectly straight, his chin held high, watching the flawless execution of the salute with an expression of profound, unwavering respect. He understood exactly what was happening. He understood the honor and the brotherhood that demanded this level of absolute discipline. The silence that followed the thunderous snap of the salute was even more profound than before. It was a heavy, expectant stillness that pressed down on the room, weighing heavily on the shoulders of the terrified guests. The air felt charged with static electricity. The entire perimeter of the venue was locked down by a wall of saluting operators, forming an unbroken tunnel of white and gold that led directly from the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall toward the front. But the tunnel did not point toward the altar. It did not point toward Chelsea or the waiting groom. The formation was deliberately angled to create a clear, unobstructed path leading straight toward the dark, neglected corner behind the towering floral arrangement. I stood in the shadows, my heart hammering a steady, powerful rhythm against my ribs. I brought my own right hand up, snapping off a crisp, rigid salute to match my brother's in arms. I held my hand perfectly steady against the brim of my cover, keeping my eyes locked on the open doorway at the back of the room. My parents had told me to hide so I would not embarrass them. They had banished me to the darkness because they believed I was a failure who did not deserve to be seen. But the highest echelons of the United States military were about to violently correct their assessment. A tall, imposing figure stepped slowly through the heavy oak doors. He wore the immaculate uniform of a four-star admiral in the United States Navy, the commander of the United States Special Operations Command. His presence carried the crushing, undeniable weight of absolute supreme authority. The gold braids on his sleeves and the massive, colorful ribbon rack on his chest caught the light, radiating a brilliant, commanding glow. He stepped over the threshold and paused, surveying the paralyzed room, with eyes that had overseen global conflicts and commanded hundreds of thousands of troops. The grand hall remained locked in a deathly, terrified silence, waiting for his first move. The ultimate reckoning had officially arrived, and the golden child perfect day was about to be permanently, irrevocably eclipsed. The four-star admiral stepped fully over the threshold, and the heavy oak doors closed silently behind him. His black dress shoes struck the polished marble floor with a slow, deliberate rhythm that commanded the absolute attention of every single breathing soul in the grand hall. He was a man who carried the immense, crushing weight of global military operations on his shoulders, yet he moved with an effortless, commanding grace. The gold braiding on his sleeves caught the light of the crystal chandeliers, projecting an aura of supreme, unquestionable authority. The wealthy guests seated in the gilded chairs shrank back as he passed their expensive suits and designer gowns, feeling entirely inadequate in the presence of true power. Richard and Patricia were standing near the front row, their faces pale and slick with panicked sweat. They watched the admiral approach with wide, terrified eyes. Patricia took a hesitant step forward, her hands clasped together in a desperate, pleading gesture. She believed the admiral was walking toward the altar to address the disruption. She foolishly assumed he was going to apologize to the prominent families for the intrusion and order his men to stand down. Preston puffed out his chest, attempting to look respectable, while Chelsea stood frozen, clutching her wilting bouquet of white orchids. They all waited for the commander of the United States Special Operations Command to validate their high society wedding. The admiral did not even spare them a fraction of a glance. He walked straight past the front row, completely ignoring my father's desperate attempt to make eye contact. He walked past the terrified hedge fund executives and the stunned politicians. He bypassed the elaborate floral archway and the lavishly decorated altar as if they were nothing more than empty air. He did not acknowledge the bride. He did not acknowledge the groom. He treated the entire multi-million-dollar production with absolute chilling indifference. His focus was entirely locked on the back corner of the room. He marched directly toward the towering wall of white hydrangeas and pale pink roses that my parents had used to banish me. When he reached the massive floral pillar, he stopped. He did not ask the wedding planner to move it. He did not wait for the catering staff. He simply raised his hand and gestured to the two massive seal operators standing at parade rest nearby. The operators stepped forward, grabbed the heavy iron bases of the floral arrangements, and violently shoved them aside. The expensive flowers dragged across the marble floor, scattering white petals and crushed leaves in their wake. The physical barrier was completely dismantled in a matter of seconds. The sudden removal of the flowers exposed my dark corner to the entire room. The bright lights of the chandeliers flooded into the shadows, illuminating my pristine white navy dress uniform. I stood at perfect rigid attention, my heels locked together and my chin held high. I maintained my crisp salute, staring directly into the eyes of the four-star admiral. The guests in the front rows twisted in their seats, craning their necks to see who the military commander had crossed the room to find. My parents let out simultaneous gasps of horror as my isolated banishment was publicly violently reversed. The admiral stood 2 feet in front of me. He looked at the gold oak leaves on my collar and the colorful ribbon rack resting over my heart. The stern, hardened lines of his face softened into an expression of profound, undeniable respect. He raised his right hand and returned my salute, holding it for a long, deliberate moment before snapping his arm back to his side. It was a gesture of absolute validation that completely obliterated the years of toxic insults and belittlement my biological family had subjected me to. I lowered my hand, matching his movement precisely. The admiral turned his back to me and faced the stunned audience. He looked down the long center aisle, his piercing gaze sweeping over the terrified faces of the corporate sharks and the socialites. He locked eyes with my father, who was practically hyperventilating near the front row. When the Admiral finally spoke, his voice did not require a microphone. It carried the raw, booming resonance of a man who commanded the most lethal operators on the planet. You sit in this opulent room surrounded by imported flowers and expensive champagne. The Admiral began, his voice dripping with a cold, terrifying contempt. You wear custom suits and boast about your financial empires. You measure a person's worth by the size of their stock portfolio and the exclusivity of their country club membership. I understand that just an hour ago, the woman standing behind me was ordered to hide in the shadows. I understand she was told her uniform was tacky and her career was a disappointing failure. I understand she was referred to as a glorified government worker who stamped passports at a desk. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. The wealthy guests turned their heads to stare at Richard and Patricia, whose faces had drained of all blood. They were completely exposed. Their cruel, arrogant insults had been repeated aloud by a four-star admiral in front of their most important investors and political allies. The public humiliation was absolute and devastating. "Let me correct your monumental, staggering ignorance," the Admiral continued, his voice rising in volume and intensity. "The woman standing behind me is Lieutenant Commander Rebecca. She does not stamp passports. She does not work a safe, comfortable desk job. She is a highly decorated intelligence officer attached to Naval Special Warfare. For the past 240 days, she has been deployed to one of the most hostile, unforgiving combat zones on the face of the earth." The silence in the grand hall deepened, becoming so thick it felt like it could shatter the glass windows. The hedge fund managers who had laughed at my father jokes during the rehearsal dinner suddenly looked physically sick. The illusion of their superiority was crumbling into dust. As commander of the United States Special Operations Command, I possess the authority to declassify specific operational details when the situation demands it, the Admiral announced, his voice echoing off the stone pillars. "I am officially declassifying the events of Operation Silent Dawn, which concluded exactly 72 hours ago. This room will hear exactly what this so-called disappointment achieved while you were busy selecting the color of your table linens." The Admiral squared his broad shoulders and delivered the truth with brutal, unyielding precision. 3 weeks ago, 2 entire platoons of our elite Navy SEALs were conducting a highly sensitive reconnaissance mission deep behind enemy lines. The operational environment was completely non-permissive. The intelligence was flawed and the situation deteriorated rapidly. Our men were ambushed by a massive, coordinated enemy force. They were heavily outnumbered, heavily outgunned, and completely pinned down in a fortified valley. The enemy engaged electronic warfare protocols, successfully jamming our satellite uplinks and severing their primary communications. They were blind cut off and facing imminent total annihilation. I watched from the back of the room as the reality of his words hit the wealthy crowd. The trivial concerns of their daily lives, offshore accounts, social media followers, and corporate mergers completely evaporated in the face of raw, terrifying combat reality. Chelsea stood at the altar looking like a frightened child playing dress-up in a white gown. She had spent her entire life trying to make me feel small. But the Admiral was currently painting a picture of a world so massive and dangerous, she could not even comprehend it. Lieutenant Commander Rebecca was stationed in a remote tactical operations center miles away from the ambush. The Admiral continued, his voice vibrating with fierce pride. When the primary communications failed and the command structure prepared for the catastrophic loss of 2 entire SEAL platoons, she refused to accept defeat. She did not panic, she did not surrender. She single-handedly bypassed the enemy electronic warfare jamming by manually rerouting encrypted analog signals through an obsolete satellite network. She re-established a fragile, broken line of communication with the pinned-down operators. The operators lining the walls of the venue stood at perfect attention, but I could see the subtle shifts in their postures. The pride radiating from the 300 men was a tangible physical force. These were the men who knew exactly what that mission entailed. These were the men whose brothers had been trapped in that valley. For 48 consecutive hours, Lieutenant Commander Rebecca did not sleep. The Admiral stayed, his gaze locking onto my father's terrified face. She did not eat. She remained glued to her terminal, operating entirely on sheer willpower and absolute tactical brilliance. She analyzed the chaotic, fragmented terrain data in real time. She orchestrated a highly complex, multi-tiered exfiltration strategy, identifying a narrow, treacherous escape corridor that the enemy had overlooked. She guided our operators step by step, inch by inch, through hostile territory under the cover of darkness. She coordinated precise danger close air support to cover their movements. The Admiral paused, letting the sheer magnitude of the operation sink into the minds of the paralyzed guests. The room was so quiet I could hear the sharp intake of breath from the socialite sitting in the third row. Because of the relentless, brilliant actions of the woman you tried to hide behind a flower arrangement, every single one of those operators made it to the extraction point, the Admiral said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. She did not just perform a job. She saved the lives of 42 American heroes. She brought our brothers home. She is the absolute embodiment of honor, courage, and commitment. She is a tactical genius and a national treasure. You called her a failure because she does not fit into your shallow, superficial world. The truth is, your entire world is not worthy of shining her combat boots. The revelation struck the country club like a kinetic strike. The wealthy guests stared at me, sitting in the shadows, completely awestruck. The billionaire patriarch Preston grandfather stood up from his VIP seat in the front row. He ignored his furious family and turned his body completely around, facing my dark corner. He snapped his heels together and delivered a crisp, sharp military salute, ignoring his advanced age and his expensive tailored suit. He understood the profound weight of what I had done. He saw past the petty family drama and recognized the absolute terrifying reality of saving 42 lives in the dark. My parents looked like they were going to collapse. Patricia covered her mouth with her trembling hands, tears ruining her perfect makeup. These were not tears of joy or pride. They were tears of absolute horrifying shame. She realized that the entire elite social circle she had spent her life cultivating now looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. She had publicly mocked and banished a hero to protect an influencer wedding aesthetic. Richard stumbled backward, holding onto the wooden pew for support. His corporate empire, his arrogant dominance, and his entire fragile identity had been publicly, violently dismantled by the commander of the United States Special Operations Command. The golden child perfect day was completely, utterly dead. The truth had finally been unleashed in the grand hall. The entire room was waiting for the final, ultimate recognition of my sacrifice to begin. The Admiral's words hung in the air, a heavy, undeniable testament to the brutal reality of combat and the absolute necessity of decisive action. The room was so silent that the faint hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roaring engine. The wealthy guests who had spent the evening comparing stock portfolios and boasting about their corporate acquisitions were now completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the narrative they had just heard. They were looking at me, a woman my own parents had deemed a failure, and they were seeing something they could barely comprehend. They were seeing a tactical mastermind who had held the lives of 42 elite warfighters in her hands and brought them all back alive. The Admiral turned his body, slowly facing me directly. The immense, crushing weight of his presence was overwhelming, but I did not break my military bearing. I kept my eyes locked onto his, maintaining my rigid posture. The physical distance between us was less than 2 feet. He reached into the breast pocket of his immaculate white uniform jacket. He did not pull out a piece of paper or a set of orders. He withdrew a small, dark blue velvet box. The velvet caught the light of the chandeliers, contrasting sharply with the pristine white fabric of his uniform. The collective intake of breath from the 300 seals lining the perimeter of the room was an audible physical sound. They knew exactly what that box contained. They knew the profound, terrifying weight of the metal inside. Lieutenant Commander Rebecca, the Admiral said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant register that vibrated with raw emotion. The United States Special Operations Command does not issue this decoration lightly. It is reserved for those who demonstrate extraordinary heroism and absolute unwavering commitment to their brothers and sisters in arms. You operated in the darkest, most hostile environment imaginable. You refused to accept defeat when catastrophic failure was the most probable outcome. You placed the lives of your fellow operators above your own safety, and you executed a flawless tactical exfiltration that will be studied in military academies for decades to come. He opened the velvet box. Nestled inside on a bed of pale silk was a bronze cross suspended from a navy blue ribbon with a single white stripe down the center. It was the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor that a member of the United States Navy could receive. It was a medal forged in blood and sacrifice, a physical representation of the highest possible level of combat heroism, short of the Medal of Honor. The guests in the front rows stared at the bronze medal, their mouths hanging open in sheer disbelief. My father Richard looked like he was going to vomit. His face was a sickly shade of gray, his arrogant corporate dominance completely erased by the presence of true, undeniable valor. The Admiral stepped closer. He carefully removed the Navy Cross from the velvet box. He reached up and pinned the medal directly above the colorful ribbon rack on my left breast pocket. His hands were steady, his movements precise and deliberate. The cold metal of the cross settled against the fabric of my uniform, carrying a weight that felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced. It was the weight of 42 lives, the weight of my command, and the weight of my brother's absolute trust. The Admiral stepped back and looked at the medal, then looked directly into my eyes. His expression was a mixture of fierce pride and profound respect. On behalf of the President of the United States and the United States Navy, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, "I present you with the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in the line of duty. You are a credit to your uniform and to this nation." I did not smile. I did not cry. I maintained my rigid military bearing, feeling the overwhelming surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. The isolation, the insults, and the years of toxic abuse from my biological family dissolved into absolute nothingness. They had tried to banish me to the shadows, but the commander of the United States Special Operations Command had just bathed me in the brightest light imaginable. I raised my right hand and executed a crisp, flawless salute, holding it perfectly steady. The Admiral returned the salute instantly, his movement sharp and precise. Then the most terrifying and beautiful sound in the world ripped through the grand hall. It did not come from the string quartet or the wealthy guests. It came from the perimeter walls. The Master Chief, who had confronted my father earlier, issued a single sharp command. Present arms. The 300 Navy SEALs and Special Operations Support Staff moved with violent, perfect synchronization. They did not snap their hands up in a rapid, fluid motion. They executed a slow, deliberate salute. It was a gesture reserved for profound, immense respect. The slow, methodical movement was a physical manifestation of their absolute, unwavering loyalty. The sound of 300 hands slicing through the air and stopping perfectly at the brims of their white service covers was a kinetic shockwave. The guests physically flinched as the sound cracked through the silent room. The operators held the salute, their eyes locked entirely on me. They were not looking at the four-star admiral. They were not looking at the furious bride standing alone at the altar. They were looking at the intelligence officer who had kept them alive in the dark. I looked around the room, taking in the faces of the men who formed the perimeter. I recognized several of them from the extraction. I saw the scars, the exhaustion, and the fierce, undeniable brotherhood in their eyes. They had traveled across the country, crashed a high society wedding, and locked down a country club simply to honor the woman who brought them home. The silence stretched for a long, agonizing moment. The wealthy elite, the venture capitalists, and the politicians were trapped in the middle of a military ceremony they could not possibly comprehend. They were forced to witness a level of raw, authentic power that made their offshore bank accounts and their country club memberships look completely irrelevant. Patricia was slumped in her gilded chair, her perfect aesthetic utterly destroyed. She had tried to hide me so I would not ruin the wedding photos. Now the only images anyone would ever remember from this day were the 300 operators saluting the daughter she had banished. Order arms. The Master Chief command echoed again, and the 300 hands snapped back to their sides in perfect unison. The kinetic crack of the movement signaled the end of the formal ceremony. The Admiral lowered his salute and turned to face the front of the room. He looked at my father, Richard, who was leaning heavily against a wooden pew, his face completely devoid of color. The Admiral did not say a word to him. He simply offered a look of absolute freezing contempt. It was a look that conveyed exactly what he thought of a man who would treat an American hero like a shameful secret. The Admiral turned back to me, offering a single respectful nod before marching slowly, deliberately back down the center aisle toward the heavy oak doors. The power dynamic in the room had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The Golden Child Perfect Day was a smoking ruin. The corporate networking event was entirely dead. The truth had been unleashed with brutal, overwhelming force, and the consequences were about to hit my biological family like a freight train. I stood in my corner, the Navy Cross gleaming on my chest, waiting for the fallout to begin. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind the Admiral, sealing the profound, absolute silence within the grand hall. The echo of his footsteps faded, but the monumental weight of his revelation pressed down on the room like a physical force. The 300 operators remained standing at the perimeter, their hands resting comfortably at their sides, their eyes locked in a fierce, protective gaze directed at my corner. The air conditioning hummed softly, a stark contrast to the boiling tension radiating from the front rows. The venture capitalists, the politicians, and the corporate executives were entirely motionless. Their champagne flutes sat forgotten on the polished marble floors. Their expensive embossed wedding programs lay crumpled in their laps. They were looking at my parents not with the polite admiration they had offered during the rehearsal dinner, but with a cold, calculating scrutiny. In the ruthless world of high society and corporate dominance, weakness and poor judgment were cardinal sins. Richard and Patricia had just been publicly humiliated by the highest echelons of the United States military. They had been exposed as cruel, arrogant fools who could not even recognize the genuine heroism of their own blood. The social currency my father had spent millions to acquire was evaporating right before his eyes. The elite guests were already mentally distancing themselves, severing the invisible networking ties they had formed just an hour prior. Richard felt the shift in the room immediately. He possessed a predator instinct for reading a boardroom, and right now, the board was preparing to entirely liquidate his social standing. His face transitioned from a sickly gray back to a flushed, panicked red. He desperately needed to reclaim the narrative. He needed to spin this catastrophic disaster into a triumphant public relations victory. He looked at Patricia, his eyes wide and frantic, silently demanding she fix the collapsing aesthetic. Patricia understood the assignment. She was a master of artificial emotion and rapid social recalculation. She smoothed the front of her designer lace gown and forced her trembling lips into a massive, sickeningly bright smile. She ignored Chelsea, who was still standing frozen and forgotten at the altar. She ignored the confused and terrified groom. Patricia turned her back on the wedding ceremony entirely and faced the wealthy crowd. She clasped her hands together, performing a perfect imitation of an overwhelmed, weeping mother. She let out a loud, theatrical gasp that echoed through the silent hall. "Oh my goodness," Patricia cried out, her voice dripping with manufactured awe and forced maternal pride. She took a step toward the center aisle, projecting her voice so the VIP section would hear every single syllable. "That is our daughter. We are so incredibly proud of her. She has always been so humble, so modest about her achievements. We had absolutely no idea she was organizing such a massive surprise for Chelsea's special day." The sheer audacity of her pivot was staggering. Patricia was actually trying to claim my military decoration as a planned family surprise. She was attempting to hijack the Navy Cross and spin it into a touching display of sibling affection. She took another step forward, moving away from the front row, and marching down the aisle directly toward my dark corner. She held her arms out wide, preparing to embrace me in front of the cameras. She wanted the videographers to capture the beautiful, touching reunion of the proud mother and the decorated war hero. She wanted to slap a fresh coat of paint over the rotting foundation of her family dynamic. Richard quickly followed a few paces behind her, nodding enthusiastically and wiping a fake tear from his eye. They thought they could simply smile and rug sweep the years of toxic abuse. They assumed the military operators would part like the Red Sea to allow the loving parents to reach their daughter. They were fundamentally, tragically mistaken. Patricia hurried past the third row, her arms extended, her smile plastered firmly in place. She reached the back of the room, aiming straight for the gap in the floral arrangement where I stood. She did not even make it within 10 feet of me. The Master Chief, the giant, battle-hardened operator who had confronted my father earlier, moved with a fluid, terrifying speed. He stepped smoothly into the center of the aisle, completely blocking Patricia's path. He did not raise his hands or adopt an aggressive fighting stance. He simply stood there, a massive, immovable wall of muscle and white fabric. Patricia practically collided with his broad chest. She gasped and stumbled backward, her high heels skidding slightly on the marble. "Excuse me," she snapped, her fake smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "I need to get through to my daughter." The Master Chief did not shift a single inch. He looked down at her with the same freezing contempt the Admiral had displayed. "You will remain exactly where you are, ma'am," he stated, his deep voice vibrating with absolute, unyielding authority. "You have not been granted permission to approach the officer." Patricia opened her mouth to argue, ready to deploy her usual tactics of wealthy entitlement. She was accustomed to speaking to managers and demanding compliance from hired staff. But the words completely died in her throat when she looked into the Master Chief's eyes. She saw a man who could not be bought, intimidated, or manipulated. She saw a man who knew exactly what kind of monster she was. Richard caught up to her, grabbing her elbow and trying to gently pull her back. "Let us just give her a moment, Patricia," he hissed nervously, shooting terrified glances at the operators lining the walls. "This is highly irregular. We should just wait for the ceremony to conclude." I stood perfectly still, letting the silence stretch for another agonizing moment. I looked past the Master Chief's massive shoulder and stared directly at my parents. They were trembling. The facade of the powerful corporate dynasty was completely shattered, leaving only two desperate, fearful bullies exposed to the harsh light of reality. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The grand hall was so quiet that every single syllable I spoke carried effortlessly to the very front rows. "Do not pretend you are proud of me, Patricia," I said, my voice cold, clear, and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Do not attempt to use my command and my brothers in arms as a prop for your superficial social climbing. You do not get to claim my Navy Cross to impress Preston family. You do not get to rewrite history because the commander of Special Operations Command just exposed your staggering ignorance." A collective murmur of shock rippled through the wealthy guests. They leaned forward, completely captivated by the brutal public dismantling of the Richard and Patricia illusion. Patricia clutched her chest, her eyes darting frantically toward the VIP section. "Rebecca, please!" she begged, her voice trembling with genuine panic now. "Not here, not in front of everyone. We are a family. We can talk about this in private." "We are not a family," I stated flatly, refusing to give her an inch of ground. "And we certainly do not keep things private when it no longer suits your aesthetic. Less than an hour ago, you dragged me by the arm through the back corridors of this country club. You shoved a cheap polyester catering uniform into my chest and ordered me to change. You demanded that I disguise myself as hired help because my presence as a military officer would embarrass you in front of the hedge fund executives sitting in this room. You told me my uniform was a tacky security guard costume that would ruin your perfect high society illusion." The gasps from the audience were audible now. Several of the corporate wives in the front rows covered their mouths in horror. The venture capitalists stared at Richard with expressions of absolute, profound disgust. It was one thing to be ruthless in business, but openly degrading a highly decorated combat veteran daughter to impress wealthy strangers was a social sin they could not ignore. Preston's father shook his head slowly, a look of severe revulsion crossing his face. "When I refused to wear the waiter uniform, you banished me to this corner." I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy air with surgical precision. You ordered me to stand behind a wall of flowers so the cameras would not accidentally capture my face. You told me to stay completely hidden and stop being a massive disappointment. You explicitly ordered me to stay out of the way so I would not ruin Chelsea's flawless aesthetic. So I strongly suggest you turn around and walk back to your assigned seat in the front row. I am simply following your exact instructions. I am staying perfectly hidden right here in the shadows, holding the line with the only family that actually matters to me. I looked directly at Richard, who was physically shrinking under the intense judgmental stares of his former business allies. You wanted me to be invisible, Richard, I said, driving the final nail into the coffin of his reputation. You wanted to erase my existence because my life of service did not match your balance sheets. You thought you possessed the authority to dictate my worth. But you forgot one critical detail. I do not take orders from cowards who steal from their own children to fund their superficial lifestyles. The mention of stolen money caused the room to erupt into frantic, hushed whispers. The guests were completely scandalized. Richard's face drained of the last remaining drop of color. He opened his mouth, but a sharp, choking sound was the only thing that emerged. Patricia was openly sobbing now, but the tears generated absolutely zero sympathy from the crowd. She reached a shaking hand toward me, but the Master Chief immediately shifted his stance, his hand resting casually but firmly near his hip. The subtle warning was abundantly clear. If she took one more step toward me, she would be physically intercepted. The 300 operators standing along the perimeter remained absolutely motionless, but their collective presence amplified my words. They were the silent, deadly witnesses to my parents' total destruction. They formed an unbreakable barrier between me and the toxic manipulation I had endured my entire life. I stood tall, my pristine white uniform glowing the Navy Cross, heavy and grounding against my chest. I did not break my gaze. I did not flinch. I watched my parents realize with absolute horrifying certainty that their social empire was completely dead and they had provided the very spark that burned it all to the absolute ground. The silence in the grand hall was already absolute, but it somehow managed to deepen. The kind of profound, heavy quiet that precedes a devastating seismic event. In the very center of the VIP section in the front row, a single figure slowly rose to his feet. It was Harrison, the billionaire patriarch of the Grooms family. The man whose vast empire of global real estate and corporate acquisitions had been the ultimate prize my parents were so desperately trying to secure. He did not move with the frantic, panicked energy of my father or the theatrical desperation of my mother. He stood up with the rigid, precise posture of a man who had faced death and conquered it. He stepped out of the gilded pew and into the center aisle. He adjusted the cuffs of his simple dark suit. He did not look at his grandson Preston, who was cowering near the altar. He did not look at the sobbing bride. His sharp, piercing eyes were locked entirely on my parents. The soft, romantic lighting of the chandeliers cast long shadows across his deeply lined face, highlighting a jagged scar near his jawline that no amount of wealth could ever erase. The rhythmic tap of his cane against the polished marble floor echoed like a judge gavel demanding total order. Richard scrambled backward, giving Harrison space. My father tried to arrange his face into a mask of polite deference, but his jaw was trembling so violently, his teeth were audibly chattering. Patricia covered her mouth with both hands, attempting to muffle her pathetic sobs. They believed Harrison was coming to save them. They hoped his immense wealth and social standing would somehow override the military authority currently occupying the room. They thought the patriarch of this billionaire dynasty would side with his fellow corporate elites and demand the operators leave. Harrison stopped directly in front of Richard. The height difference was negligible, but the disparity in their presence was staggering. Harrison radiated a cold, lethal gravity. He leaned heavily on his cane, but his shoulders remained perfectly squared. He looked at my father with an expression of such pure, unadulterated revulsion that several guests sitting nearby physically flinched. I sat in the shadows of the lounge last night. Harrison began, his voice a low, rough gravel that commanded absolute attention. I listened to you drink my scotch and mock the United States Armed Forces. I listened to you call a military career a safety net for people who lacked a killer instinct. I listened to you brag about your superficial accomplishments while actively diminishing the blood and sweat of the woman standing in the back of this room. Richard's face went from pale to a sickly translucent gray. He opened his mouth to offer an excuse to claim he had been drinking or joking, but Harrison slammed the rubber tip of his cane hard against the marble floor. The sharp crack cut off my father completely. "Do not speak," Harrison commanded, his tone slicing through the air like a combat knife. "You do not have the right to speak in the presence of actual honor. I watched you back your daughter into a corner and gaslight her. I watched you attempt to break the spirit of a combat veteran because her mere existence threatened your fragile, pathetic ego. You sit in your air-conditioned offices moving imaginary money from one offshore account to another, and you genuinely believe that makes you powerful. You believe it makes you superior to the men and women who bleed in the dirt so you can sleep peacefully in your gated communities." Harrison turned his head slightly, addressing the entire room of wealthy executives and high society socialites. His voice rose, carrying the unmistakable cadence of a military commander addressing his troops. 50 years ago, I served as a Marine in the jungles of Vietnam." Harrison announced the revelation, sending a visible shockwave through the crowd. "I commanded a rifle platoon in the deepest green hell you could possibly imagine. I watched good men die in the mud. I held teenagers as they took their last breaths begging for their mothers. I know exactly what combat costs. I know the permanent scars it leaves on your soul. And I know exactly what it takes to earn the decoration currently pinned to that young woman's chest." He raised his cane and pointed it directly at me, acknowledging the Navy Cross gleaming against my pristine white uniform. The crowd turned to look at the medal with a renewed sense of profound, terrifying reverence. To earn a Navy Cross requires a level of selfless, unimaginable bravery that not a single person in this civilian room possesses, Harrison stated, his voice vibrating with fierce, fierce anger. "It requires stepping into the jaws of death to pull your brothers out. And you, Richard, you took a woman who orchestrated the survival of 42 American heroes and you told her to hide behind a flower arrangement. You handed her a cheap catering uniform and told her she was a tacky embarrassment to your aesthetic. You are a disgusting, soulless coward. You are the absolute lowest form of human garbage I have ever had the misfortune of encountering." Patricia let out a loud, wailing sob, dropping to her knees on the marble floor. She reached out and grabbed the hem of Harrison's dark suit jacket, her expensive lace gown pooling around her in a pathetic heap. "Please," Patricia begged, her voice thick with panic and humiliation. "We did not know. We were just trying to make Chelsea Day perfect. We did not mean to disrespect the military." Harrison looked down at my mother with eyes that held absolutely zero mercy. He roughly yanked his suit jacket out of her desperate grip, stepping back as if her touch might infect him. "You did not do this out of ignorance," Harrison said, his voice dropping to a freezing whisper. "You did this out of pure malicious vanity. You stole your own daughter college fund to finance a failed vanity project for your golden child. You banished a hero to the shadows because you wanted to pretend she did not exist. You are a toxic rot pretending to be a family. You care about nothing but the price tag on your clothes and the names on your guest list." The billionaire patriarch turned his back on my sobbing parents, completely dismissing them from his reality. He pivoted slowly, resting his weight on his cane, and locked his eyes onto the altar. Preston was standing next to Chelsea, looking like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. The groom was sweating profusely, his expensive custom tuxedo clinging to his damp skin. He tried to offer his grandfather a weak, placating smile, but it looked more like a grimace of sheer terror. "Grandfather," Preston stammered, taking a hesitant step forward, away from his bride. "Please, this has nothing to do with me. I had no idea they were treating her this way. I just wanted to marry Chelsea. We can fix this. We can ask the catering staff to set up a chair in the front row for Rebecca. We can make it right." The sheer profound stupidity of Preston's response was staggering. He was offering a folding chair to a Navy Cross recipient flanked by 300 special operations personnel, as if that would somehow undo decades of systemic abuse. He was desperately trying to salvage his own financial future by throwing his new bride and her family directly under the bus. Harrison stared at his grandson, shaking his head in absolute disgust. You are a weak, spineless fool, Preston. I have watched you grow up with every advantage this world has to offer. I paid for your Ivy League education. I gave you a position in my firm. I handed you the keys to an empire, and you have learned absolutely nothing about character or integrity. Preston faced crumbled, his hands raising in a defensive gesture. Grandfather, I love her. I love Chelsea. You love her social media following and her parents' country club connections? Harrison spat, his voice laced with bitter disappointment. You chose to align yourself with a family of superficial abusers because you are exactly like them. You stood by and watched them degrade a military officer today, and you said nothing. You cared more about the optics of your wedding photos than the basic fundamental dignity of a human being. Harrison gripped the handle of his cane, his knuckles turning white with fury. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before delivering the final catastrophic blow to the entire production. I built my company from the ground up after I returned from the war, Harrison announced, his voice echoing with absolute finality. I built it on a foundation of loyalty, discipline, and honor. I refuse to allow a single penny of my legacy to be squandered by a coward who marries into a family of toxic parasites. Preston's eyes widened in sheer unfiltered horror. No, grandfather, please, you cannot do this. I absolutely can. And I just did, Harrison stated coldly. As of this exact moment, Preston, you are completely severed from the family trust. You are officially removed from the board of directors of my firm. You will clear out your corner office by Monday morning. I am cutting you off entirely. If you want to build a life with this vain, manipulative woman and her abusive parents, you will do it on your own dime. You are no longer entitled to the protection of my name or the benefit of my wealth. The financial execution was brutal and immediate. The golden child perfect marriage had just been violently stripped of its entire economic foundation. Chelsea let out a piercing, horrified scream, dropping her massive bouquet of white orchids onto the marble floor. She stared at Preston, realizing that the billionaire lifestyle she had manipulated her way into had just evaporated into thin air. The venture capitalists and corporate sharks sitting in the audience immediately began whispering to one another, mentally recalculating their alliances. Preston was suddenly radioactive. He possessed zero capital and zero influence. Harrison did not wait to watch his grandson completely break down. He turned his body facing the back of the grand hall. He looked directly at me, standing tall and unyielding behind the line of my brothers. The billionaire patriarch raised his hand and offered me a slow, deep, respectful bow. It was a gesture of profound validation, acknowledging the shifting of power and the triumph of absolute truth. He then turned and walked briskly down the center aisle, completely ignoring the weeping bride, the paralyzed groom, and the utterly destroyed parents, leaving them all to drown in the toxic wreckage they had built for themselves. Preston stood completely paralyzed at the altar, staring at the empty space where his billionaire grandfather had just been. The reality of his catastrophic disinheritance was crashing down on him with the force of a falling building. The trust fund he had relied on his entire life was gone. His corner office at the prestigious investment firm was gone. The social safety net that had protected him from his own profound mediocrity had vanished into thin air. He was suddenly and violently financially exposed. He slowly turned his head to look at his bride. The smug, arrogant expression he had worn all afternoon had been entirely replaced by a look of vicious, panicked malice. He did not see a woman he loved. He saw a massive, toxic liability that had just cost him a global empire. Chelsea reached out a trembling hand toward him, her face slick with tears and smeared designer makeup. Preston slapped her hand away with such aggressive force that she stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the marble steps. He ripped the custom white orchid boutonniere from the lapel of his expensive Italian tuxedo and threw it forcefully onto the ground, crushing the delicate petals under his polished black shoe. He pointed a shaking finger directly at her face. He did not lower his voice to preserve the dignity of the ceremony. He wanted the entire room to hear his absolute rejection. "You ruined my life!" Preston shouted, his voice echoing through the silent, horrified grand hall. You and your pathetic, socially desperate parents just cost me billions of dollars. I am not losing my entire legacy because you people could not control your psychotic jealousy over a military uniform. There is absolutely no way I am marrying into this toxic nightmare. The wedding is completely off. We are done. He turned his back on the weeping bride and marched furiously down the side aisle, desperate to chase after his grandfather and beg for forgiveness. The sudden, brutal abandonment broke whatever fragile grip Chelsea still had on her sanity. The carefully curated high society aesthetic she had spent years designing and millions of dollars securing was officially dead. She let out a high-pitched, unhinged shriek that sounded more like a wounded animal than a human being. The sound pierced the heavy air of the country club, freezing the remaining guests in their seats. Chelsea ripped her expensive imported lace veil from her perfectly styled hair, tearing the crystal hairpins right out of her scalp and throwing the sheer fabric furiously across the altar. She was no longer a glowing, radiant bride. She was a spoiled, entitled child having a massive, uncontrollable meltdown. She stomped her feet against the marble steps, screaming at the top of her lungs. She pointed her finger at my mother, who was still crumpled on the floor in the front row. "You promised me this would be perfect!" Chelsea shrieked, her voice hoarse and raw with fury. "You promised me you would handle Rebecca. You told me she was a pathetic failure who would just sit quietly in the back. You completely ruined my life. You ruined my wedding. Everyone is staring at me." She dropped heavily to her knees, the massive skirt of her crystal-covered gown pooling awkwardly around her. She slammed her fists against the hard stone floor, sobbing and screaming incoherently. Her professional makeup ran in thick, dark streaks down her face, completely destroying her flawless aesthetic. The professional videographers who had been hired to document a fairy tale romance were still standing at their stations, their camera lenses perfectly capturing every single pathetic, humiliating second of the golden child total psychological collapse. They were documenting the raw, ugly truth of a family that had finally been stripped of its expensive artificial polish. The total implosion of the wedding party was the final signal the wealthy guests needed. The illusion of the elite, untouchable corporate dynasty was entirely shattered. Following the powerful lead of the billionaire patriarch, the state senators, the hedge fund managers, and the venture capitalists began to stand up in mass unison. They did not offer polite excuses. They did not offer superficial condolences to the weeping mother of the bride. They picked up their expensive coats and designer purses and began marching purposefully toward the side exits. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with the radioactive fallout of this catastrophic social disaster. Richard scrambled to his feet, his face dripping with cold, terrified sweat. He watched the mass exodus of his entire corporate network with sheer, blinding panic. His net worth, his business partnerships, and his entire social identity were walking out the doors. He lunged forward, grabbing the arm of a prominent tech CEO who was attempting to bypass the front row. Richard clung to the man's expensive suit sleeve, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Please, you have to understand." Richard begged, a pathetic whine replacing his usual arrogant, booming voice. "This is just a massive misunderstanding. A terrible family dispute. We are still on for our merger meeting on Monday morning. I can explain everything in the boardroom." The tech CEO yanked his arm out of my father's frantic grip with a look of pure, unadulterated revulsion. He looked at Richard as if he were a diseased insect. "There will be no meeting on Monday." Richard the executive stated, his tone dripping with freezing contempt. "My firm does not partner with cowards who abuse combat veterans to protect their fragile social standing. Our professional relationship is permanently terminated. Do not ever contact my office again." Richard staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. He watched the CEO walk away, taking tens of millions of dollars in corporate backing with him. My father spun around, frantically reaching out to other fleeing investors, but they all aggressively avoided his gaze, sidestepping his desperate, grasping hands. He was entirely isolated in a crowded room, watching his entire empire evaporate into absolute nothingness in a matter of seconds. Patricia remained a sobbing, crumpled heap on the floor, completely ignored by the high society crowd. she had spent her entire life desperately trying to impress. They stepped around her as if she were a piece of discarded garbage on the polished marble. From my position at the corner, I observed the total destruction of my biological family with cold clinical detachment. The heavy weight of the Navy Cross rested securely against my chest, a grounding physical reminder of reality. I did not feel the urge to scream at them. I did not feel the need to march to the front of the room and gloat over their magnificent downfall. I did not need to kick them while they were bleeding out on the floor. Their own monumental arrogance, their toxic vanity, and their relentless cruelty had engineered a punishment far more devastating and permanent than anything I could have personally inflicted. I felt absolutely nothing for them. The emotional ties had been completely severed. The four-star admiral turned away from the chaotic, humiliating spectacle at the altar. He faced me, his expression shifting back to one of profound, respectful composure. He offered a single definitive nod. The operation was successfully concluded. The truth had been secured. It was time to leave this toxic wasteland behind. The Master Chief stepped forward and issued a sharp, quiet command that carried effortlessly down the perimeter line. The 300 operators along the walls instantly broke their rigid perimeter formation. They did not rush or break their military bearing. They moved with terrifying, unified precision, transitioning smoothly from a static defensive line into a tight, dynamic escort formation. They collapsed inward, forming a massive, impenetrable phalanx of broad shoulders and crisp white uniforms directly around me. The Admiral stepped aside, allowing me to take the absolute lead of the formation. I squared my shoulders, keeping my chin held high and my eyes locked perfectly forward. I began the slow, measured walk down the center aisle. The synchronized heavy tread of 300 pairs of polished leather boots echoed through the grand hall, completely drowning out the pathetic sound of Chelsea screaming on the floor and Richard begging his fleeing investors. I did not turn my head to look at the altar. I did not cast a single glance at the weeping woman in the front row or the ruined, desperate man frantically grasping at disappearing wealth. They were completely, entirely irrelevant to my existence. I walked through the center of the chaotic, crumbling venue flanked by a wall of absolute lethal brotherhood. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall stood wide open, revealing the bright, blinding sunlight of the late afternoon. The suffocating artificial air of the country club gave way to the crisp, clean breeze coming from the outside. I stepped confidently over the threshold, crossing from the toxic darkness into the brilliant light. I walked out the front doors, surrounded by 300 fierce, loyal brothers in arms and a four-star admiral, leaving my biological family to drown permanently in the miserable, suffocating ashes of their own staggering arrogance. I stepped forward into a future built on absolute truth, profound honor, and an unbreakable bond that no amount of money could ever buy. The greatest lesson I learned walking out of those heavy oak doors, leaving my biological family in the ruins of their own arrogance, is that true power does not require you to raise your voice. For 34 years, I desperately waited for my parents to validate my worth. I thought if I just achieved enough or stood tall enough, they would finally see me. What that day taught me is that toxic people will never recognize your light because it exposes their shadows. My parents measured human value in offshore bank accounts, designer labels, and superficial country club aesthetics. They could not comprehend the profound, unbreakable bond of shared sacrifice. They called my uniform a costume because they had never stood for anything greater than their own fragile egos. Blood does not make a family. Loyalty does. Family is not the people who banish you to the dark corners to protect their image. Family is the people who will breach the doors, secure the perimeter, and stand shoulder to shoulder with you when the world tries to make you feel small. You do not have to shrink yourself to fit at a table that was never built for you. You have the absolute right to walk away and find the people who will proudly hold the line by your side. If you have ever been treated like a disappointment by the people who were supposed to protect you, I want you to know that their blindness is not your burden to carry. Stop fighting for a seat at their toxic table. Have you ever had to walk away from abusive relatives and build your own chosen family. Share your story in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about claiming your worth, setting unbreakable boundaries, and holding the line for your own happiness.